All right.
Okay, good morning. This is the September 17th, 2021 meeting of the Vermont Climate Council Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee. We have a long meeting today. We're starting at 8:30 and going to wrap around noon. Our agenda, generally speaking, includes some administrative items, then an update on the council meeting from earlier this week, some conversations around how we make decisions as a subcommittee. And then, and sorry, I don't have the agenda in front of me, so if I'm missing anything, let me know. And then the bulk of our meeting is going to be focused on going through our matrix of pathways, strategies, and action items to try to come up with a new draft that reconciles any questions, disagreements, or missing items that folks flagged in the previous version. Thanks, Jane. Here's the agenda. We'll have opportunities for public comment throughout the day. There'll be one scheduled roughly around 1:10. Then we'll take a short break, and then there'll be another public comment around 11, and then another around 11:45. And this is so that folks who members of the public who are interested can kind of weigh in on the draft strategies matrix and provide close to real-time comments on our work. That was an interest expressed by folks last week, so we're going to try to accommodate that as best we can this morning. So I think that is it. So subcommittee members, first step is to approve that draft agenda and our minutes from the September 10th meeting. So does anyone have any questions, concerns, or comments about that? Otherwise, we'll consider them both approved. Okay, some nodding heads and silence. So those are approved. So we're good to go. Oh, that's right. Our first piece is we're gonna talk about the stakeholder meeting that happened earlier this week, the ag stakeholder meeting, just to share with the rest of the group the good work that happened then. So why don't I hand that over, I guess, to Pat, and we'll get going.
All right. So I've got a few slides. I'll try to get through these quickly. That just try to capture. I went through everybody's notes, so this is probably not going to get quite everything, but I'll hopefully get some things of what people said in the meeting. Can people see that okay? All right. I won't necessarily read every sort of bullet point, and we'll make these available too. We'll do a longer, probably bulleted point Word document too, but people raised a number of things. So the bigger story, people mentioned just that Vermont's not standalone. We sit in a larger economy, both agriculture and climate and carbon. So, concerns, worries about that. Equity came up across a number of ways: scale, BIPOC farmers, access to all programs, even non-commercial farmers, access to programs. And then there were some things that I think people kind of named, maybe felt maybe were missing from our work: fiber, honey, maple, ag materials as building materials, and then pollination and allowing native species to ensure pollinators, which came up from one of the beekeepers in John Roberts' coalition. There were a lot of actually conversations about local food and markets, and how actually more local food and more local sort of systems like slaughterhouses all actually are tied to actually the way you farm and regenerative farming. And so people didn't actually see those as distinct, but actually highly related. So I won't go through everything here, but there were a number of things people really talked about local foods and markets as part of the story here that was important. In terms of actions to take, I think people supported soil health focus and regenerative agriculture. There were a number of things people mentioned about practices. Keep going on the ones that are good, make them more sophisticated and nuanced. Maybe government should stop subsidizing those practices that maybe aren't so great for climate. There were new things mentioned around sort of composting and organics. There were some things around calculations that came up from a few people. I just pulled a few things from chat. And then there was, generally support or conversation about a PES-like program as well. There was a fair amount of interest in technical assistance, particularly farmer to farmer and teaching farmers by farmers, or a farmer climate corps. And also just a lot of support for strong funding for TA, because it isn't going to work without some kind of technical assistance in a variety of ways. On programs, people just had some comments about they have to be inclusive, they have to be flexible, and they have to be easy to use and accessible for folks, or people aren't going to do them. Was some concern across a number of commenters about, do you get credit for good work you've already done if you're a first mover, or do you get kind of penalized and not get credit for something you already did? There was a few comments about wetlands programs not paying enough to be used. So obviously just an underlying concern about they have to be sufficient incentives to act. And there was concern about long-term funding and whether or not that was going to, whether this is going to be, even though it's a long-term play, are we going to have long-term funding? And then people mentioned a few new things around agroforestry, this common land model. I just put the link, someone put it in chat, and a focus on flooding and upland soils, which is somewhat related to what you, I think, have covered, but it came up in the groups. There was a little bit about land conservation, not a ton actually, but a little bit. Some about marginal farmland kind of going back, quote unquote, some concern about land grabs and climigration, and some support for more public lands or a more kind of a different approach to kind of how land title works. Other concerns that came up, I didn't worry about them, is GMOs, pesticides, and herbicides came up a few places for sure. And that, well, actually we have that, we'll talk about that today. There was this back and forth about conventional, quote unquote, versus newer agriculture, large versus small. And there was some differing opinions about that. I'm not so sure from farmers, but some of the folks in the group about that. And I think John, as you know, emphasized we're kind of all in this together, so let's not go there. And then there's a little bit about fossil fuels and reducing plastics and going to electric and those things as well. So that was a rough summary, but a lot of you were there. Anything that I missed or key things you heard you wanted to make sure the subcommittee knew about?
So I guess the one thing I would add to that is that I heard a lot, maybe you did already say this, I'm sorry, Pat, the coffee hasn't fully penetrated yet. But there was a feeling from the farmers that there does need to be a lot more done with public education and outreach to help the public understand what the work of the farmers is. And I would kind of back this, the average person is 3 to 4 generations removed from the farm. And so that sort of ingrained working knowledge of what agriculture is and how it functions is not as much a part of the public conscious anymore. And so how can we kind of help folks to understand what it is that agriculture performs on the behalf of the greater good and the public at large? And then the other thing is, it's a thing you hear from farmers all the time, but kind of in line with the, people not being left behind for being early adopters or first movers and needing to get credit for that, but also just the fact that due to macroeconomic forces beyond their control, so many of these things the farmers are willing to do, but there literally isn't the money to do it within their business economics. And so how do we think about that broader?
Right. Other things people saw or heard that I just want to name.
Jane?
I just want to make it. Yeah, I was just going to say, I was surprised. There are two things that I didn't hear that I'm just curious if your group has thought about, and this is more from my past life and my observations in this work, like purchase of ecosystem services. I think that has a real challenge with equity in application. What I've seen, like in how it is applied, and like one farmer, like in a project that I did with Ag Agency before I transitioned out of that job, a farmer got paid a lot more than fair market value due to the contract that was put in place around payment for ecosystem services, and the farmer adjacent to him didn't get it, and it was more because he could agree to the sale price via an appraisal rather than really a value or an ecosystem service that either one was differing. And I think as we roll that out, thinking about how we really do clear criteria around who gets it and who doesn't is really going to be in service to the overall mission. And two, I'll just say that the second thing, I'm just struck by that comment about how we don't pay enough for wetlands. In the other flip side is, as an ecologist and as thinking, I'm always struck by how much people get paid for restoration of a degraded system versus intact ecosystem function. You get paid a lot more if it's degraded than you do if it's intact because of the valuation system. And so that is something like as an equity component too, and thinking about long-term goals that I've always been struck by.
Thank you so much for those comments, Jane. That is super helpful. And that has been my experience of it as well, that we're in a very reactive system in terms of how we pay for things versus proactive. And so the folks that are amenable to, you know, certain conditions or keeping things intact and stuff like that are just, you know, they're like, doing the right thing is not the rewarded thing. I'll put it at that. David?
Thanks, Abby. I guess what the conversation for me flagged out is this really fascinating two parallel universes that exist that actually are parallel. I mean, I think they're moving in a similar direction, but they're disconnected by this huge gap of knowledge and experience. I think they're both headed in the direction of a more nimble and less impactful form of agriculture that is more nimble economically, that responds, you know, that responds to economics and allows farmers to make money, and in fact creates space for new farmers to grow and expand and innovate, and to be more environmentally friendly, sustainable, clean water impacts, all that. I think everyone's headed in that direction. Even Marie Audet, you know, even the big farmers are open to kind of trying to innovate. They just have to make money and keep their land in production and continue their way of life. And there are people who want a piece of that part of life and have tremendous ideas and energy. There's two grand forces that are driving us the way they have, that are kind of beyond our control in Vermont. One is global commodity pricing, and the other is national milk pricing. We have a federal program, you know, of cheap food, which benefits consumers, and you can have all sorts of interesting political and ideological debates about whether it's good policy or not, but it's not good for Vermont. It's not good for Vermont farmers. It's not good for Vermont's economy. It's not good for Vermont's, you know, ecology. So those are huge forces that we're having to deal with. And one of the things that I heard from a couple of different folks in some of the different breakout, you know, my reading of the notes and in the breakout group I was in, there's people like Scott Magnan, you know, who works with a whole range of different farmers up in Franklin County, who's saying, we need access to capital. With access to capital, farmers can innovate. You know, it's not like a dairy farmer, you know, Marley, you know, walked me through this one day. She's like, David, you don't wake up one day with, you know, your $1 million tractor and your, you know, all your manure spreader and all the equipment and your barns and your cows and your contracts for grain and fertilizer, and then say, you know what, tomorrow I'm going to raise organic garlic. It's not economically possible. And at the same time, there's people who want to get into farming who just have no chance because of the cost of land and entry points. So I don't know if Vermont can manage this, but if Vermont could figure out a way to give farmers greater access to capital with a thumb on the scale, that's counterbalance to the fast, you know, cheap food policies that creates an economically viable pathway to innovate that doesn't require consolidation and, you know, the economies of scale that the current policies force. That's in some ways beyond even the capacity of the state government. Even if all the legislature and the governor all came together, I'm not sure they could pull that off. But I do think ultimately, without that, a lot of the work that we're doing is kind of putting band-aids on a, you know, somewhat broken system. So that's what I heard, which, and the positive part of that is that everyone, I think, is pulling in the same direction. Not everyone has the same understanding of the forces. You know, you've got the James Moroney kind of perspective, like that the state should step in as the all-powerful state and require everybody to do a form of farming that he supports, that he thinks is more sustainable economically and ecologically. And then you've got other farmers who are saying, just get the heck out of our way and we'll figure it out. And I think, I'm not sure exactly how we navigate that as a subcommittee, but I think the degree to which we build, like we have, recommendations on farm viability and access to capital and financial and economic tools, the closer we'll be to figuring a path that is both politically viable and actually makes a difference. And I'll shut up. Thanks.
Thanks, David. Marion, and then maybe just because of time, we may want to move on, but hopefully we'll keep these things in mind as we go through the matrix. So.
Well, just a quick comment, I think building off what David said, in general conversation at the event around access to capital is there was someone joined my breakout group late and brought up the idea of universal basic income for farmers that do certain like soil health management practices. And it led to a thought I was having after the event around, universal basic income or a general provision for capital across the board that really kind of tries to equal the playing field around equity. It's not an application to a fund that's, sort of the traditional access for capital, but it's a different way to approach that access for capital while also incentivizing, better management practices. So I thought that was an interesting example to bring up and build off that conversation.
Ryan had a comment?
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to two comments, I suppose. I think they broadly focus on the concept of what is payment for ecosystem services, and it is a downstream buyer paying upstream user for management changes. And I think a compelling piece of information I've heard through a stakeholder group and working group work is, David, to some of your points, the national, international economic model that drives a lot of the land users in the state to particular production methods. Some share, well, if you paid me to farm in a different way, I'd do it. And so prioritizing the ecosystem outcomes we want to see from agriculture, I think that's one opportunity that exists for compensating managers for environmental outcomes that aren't part of the milk check, aren't part of local commodity pricing for vegetables, as an example, right? But so I think there's a lot of opportunity there for centering and elevating outcomes that the state, the climate council, others may want to see through that type of mechanism. And then Jane, to your comments, I think there are some. I see it as a positive equity outcome with some of those specific projects you're referencing, where long-term in perpetuity, benefits to the state, and acknowledging where different landowners come from in their history and management, that not everyone's starting from the same place, and it may take people more to arrive at a particular decision, where some of the benefits to the state can be quantified for the rest of the time this political system continues to exist. So I think that fairness and equity and prioritization are all important things that I think some of these discussions we'll get to will help to elevate these specific questions. But I do think, however you want to frame it, a payment for ecosystem service system can certainly help elevate some of those decisions on farms as it relates to how they interface with their land when those management changes aren't represented in a change in their milk check, and may actually, in fact, make their profitability decline in the short term. So, those are my comments. Thanks.
Great. All right. Some big issues there. We'll see what we can do with those as we go through some of the details in our matrix. So good. So Billy, Abby, we're ready to go on to Jane, giving us kind of an update on guidance from the steering committee, I guess.
I think
I
so.
don't see any other hands, so I'd say move along.
Yep. Great. And I'll be right back, but carry on, Jane. Thank you.
So there's not a ton of time on this, and I know you guys are digging in, but the two main things that were discussed at the council meeting that relate to your process here, that some of which is still being ironed out and some of which is starting to come clear in view now, relates to the climate action plan drafting, and then also prioritization specifically. So I want to first mention that for the climate action plan drafting, there was a lot of different evolutions of how we were going to attack it with respect to counselor engagement. And so putting forward a plan on Tuesday to start, which is what we attempted to do, that really created vision for how counselors could see themselves in drafting and review and editing, and how the whole climate action plan was going to come together. There's a detailed outline now that is being updated based on reflections from that conversation, but that really speaks to where the policy and substantive conversation is going to happen, and how that will all be pulled up into the CAP for counselors to review on a timely basis. We have a more detailed outline that actually puts your names as task leads next to different components of the outline, and then tries to ensure that there are key state staff to support task leads in as much handwriting as you want. Like in cross-sector yesterday, we talked about this. Some of the task leads there want to really hand off their work at a certain point to have state staff support the drafting of it. Some task leads want to draft it, which are also overlap with counselors all the way through the end. And so we've provided capacity so that you have it, but there's also the ability to keep it with original authors as long as you want. So the CAP outline has a detailed schedule now. I wish I was focused on a few other things for cross-sector yesterday, but what I'd like to do for the same thing with all of you is email you all with the CAP outline that has all of your names next to the specific assignment, so that you can have a conversation about your role in it, and then put through in the more simplified version the timelines that are pertinent for you. So first and foremost being that next Tuesday, September 21st, is the date for you to distribute your comprehensive list of pathways, strategies, and actions. We've been envisioning that this would happen through the matrix that you're working on, so that counselors have a week ahead of the meeting to process the full suite of actions that are being considered at this point by Ag and Ecosystems. The following week, on that Tuesday, the September 28th, Billy and Abby, and with support from any of the subcommittee members, will present the actions that you choose to elevate for the council, recognizing that they will have access to the full suite, so that they will have hopefully done their homework to identify any gaps, red flags, or questions that they have, trying to flag those initially for you as you move into prioritization and equity screening, and compiling your final body of work. Those red flags and gaps would have been identified next week. Billy, I'll pause for a minute.
Yeah, thanks. I just got back, but I think I heard that you're still looking to see our stuff by the 21st. And I think Abby was pretty clear and articulate at the council that we're not going to have recommendations until a week from today, the 24th.
The spreadsheet.
Yeah. Is that correct, Abby?
I believe that was what I said, yes. And I'm literally not sure how we get from today to the 20th, particularly since Lauren isn't here and she's a council. I don't know how that works in terms of our process consensus versus like what Pat, I think, is going to talk about a little later, like what happens when we can't get to consent, those types of things. So I'm not really sure. I don't know.
Abby, one thing, Jane, I was going to say, what the Rural Resilience is saying about their matrix is they all kind of said they're working on a very similar big messy matrix too. And what they said is let's, for whatever it is, end of September, we all agree that what's in it should be forwarded. That doesn't mean we agree with everything in it, because then they want to go through the screening, the equity screen, and the 5 criteria screen in early to mid-October, and that's when things may get eliminated or changed further. So that was where they tried to handle this time thing, was to say we agree everything should go forward for the council to look at. It doesn't mean we agree with everything in it, and that's where they came out, for what that's worth. I don't know if you guys want to do that or not, but
it's a good conversation to have. I'll just say that the pushback on the timeline is happening in every space right now. And I just don't. It's hard for me to really say anything other than this is it. I'm also mindful of the processes that play out and how to actually feel comfortable with what you're putting up to the council. But at this point, there's no room in the schedule. And so I also feel like in order for the council to have time with the document, we're trying really clearly to articulate that we'll be sending things out a week in advance so that when we get there, council members don't say, I didn't have time to read this, I can't take action, we can't move right now, and then things get pushed further out. I also recognize that we're trying this out with you all first, being thoughtful on the timeline. So yeah, I hear you. This is, I appreciate what Pat just said about rural resilience.
Yeah, we'll see what we can do. I think my point is that we have for like 2 months been working, or at least a month, been working towards presenting on the 28th and assuming that we could get it the Friday before, because that's what we did the last time we had to present. And we built a schedule around that. That included today's meeting and Friday's meeting to complete that work, and just learned basically this week that that's not the schedule we're on. So I think we've been very intentional in trying to deliver the required product. And this is just throwing us off. So that's why I'm pushing
I hear
back
you, Billy.
on the
I actually, and I think it hasn't been written in stone, so I totally understand if that was lost on folks and I wasn't clear. But Marion and I have been trying to communicate for a few weeks now that the materials need to go a week ahead of time. And I also think that there's still work to be done to get to the 28th to figure out how and what you want to present, because there's that component of what you're going to elevate and speak to the council.
Okay.
So anyway,
We'll figure it out today.
Let's do this. Yeah, let's see what we do today. And again, about 11:45 today, we're going to see where we are and what we need to do, and you know what we can do and not do. David, you had your hand up.
I don't know if this is the right time to do it, but I had a reaction to the idea of the rural resilience proposal to kind of postpone resolution and things.
Yep, go ahead.
I think it's a terrible idea. I think, I know Vermonters hate conflict, but we've got to make some decisions. And if there's conflict, we should resolve them and figure out a path forward to do that.
I don't know if Pat, and Marion, you've been more involved too, but I wouldn't actually go as far as to say that there's conflict. I think that there's consensus that this is the suite of ideas, but there's a feeling of prioritization and other screening tools that still need to be used to really elevate what they want to put as this package of priorities forward. But nobody is feeling like none of these ideas aren't worth considering in the next step. So it's not that they're like fighting over a few actions and can't reach agreement. There's broad consensus that this is a relative package of what the work should be.
I guess it's probably needles, angels on the head of a pen disagreement, but I think what we put forward as our top priorities is a central part of what we're doing. And I think we should just, push ourselves to get as far as we possibly can in making those decisions. And the tools will never be perfect and the process will never be perfect.
And let's, again, today we hope to have those conversations. And again, let's make sure let's start diving into those soon so we can see where we end up. And the only way to know where we're going to end up is to actually do it. So hopefully today, David, we will actually, some of these issues will hopefully come right to the surface and we will debate today. Abby, you had your hand up.
I just want to make sure that it was not my understanding that we were removing things today. Is that correct?
Billy?
I don't know. I think we're trying to just, if there's disagreements.
I think I'm all for flagging the disagreements and having the discussion, and just, I don't know that I'm not sure that I'm comfortable removing anything until it's gone through the prioritization frame. I'm not sure I'm ready to take things out if it hasn't gone through I don't know.
So, so in going, when you'll find there'll be some things we'll go through where people do disagree that it should be forwarded. So those are things we're going to have to talk about today. What we do with them, I don't know. There are some things that are really about wording and like how we phrase things, like Act 250. There's like about 18 different versions of how we should word it. So that's, I think, the coverage is more about not eliminating it, but how to frame it. And then there are some things that are just, discussion we need to have. So there are some things people don't like that we're going to need to talk about. I don't know how to handle, the timing of that for everybody.
I just have one more comment about the next phase of the work. and then want to hand it back over to Billy and Abby to talk about decision making and you, Pat. I do just want to mention that we had a really great conversation about prioritization with the council that yielded a lot of good recommendations on how to proceed. Marion and I met yesterday and sort of struggled through like the details of that and worked on putting together a recommended new process that really will ultimately provide the details needed for subcommittees to actually move forward with prioritization. We intend to present that to the steering committee on Tuesday to ensure that we are representing the comments that we heard from the council. And based on that, I also want to sort of feed in and respond to how equity, the work screening and work is going to start to happen. The consultant, the contract is routed. I'm like hopeful that a final signed one will be returned to me today. We've set up a meeting for next week with the co-chairs of the subcommittees and the equity consultant to have a conversation about process and expectations, recognizing that there's been muddied waters a little bit about what the consultant is actually going to do to support subcommittees and talk through that process. As part of my conversation with the consultant, as we've been moving forward to the contract, we've been starting to think about a stepwise approach with prioritization in that it seems to make sense that there's these 5 foundational criteria that we're putting forward. There's a process to refine those definitions with science and data. They'll actually be doing that this morning in hopes of thinking about greater clarity for subcommittees around what those criteria mean and how to apply them, especially in the space of cost effectiveness and feasibility, since there's varying opinions on how to define those two in particular. But one of the things we've been thinking about in particular is some initial screen. Well, first I should say what went away based on the council conversation is an initial sorting of ready for implementation and further development, so that now the process is going to be, you're going to review by using the 5 criteria all of your actions. And so recognizing that we want it to be true to the definitions and what prioritization is, but also somewhat efficient because you have a lot of actions to review and prioritize. So working to refine that, but our hope is that you would do some initial screening that would lead you to think about where in the process an implementation schedule would look for you. So what are the highest priorities for you to implement first? And those would be the ones that you would focus on with the support of the equity facilitation in screening through the scoring rubric. What I feel like is still nebulous based on my conversations with the equity consultant who is going to join Just Transitions next Thursday night also to refine and think about the process that they come up with to ensure they're representing and being true to the work that Just Transitions intended to see, is that whether or not the expectation will be that you'll score and review all of your actions or just the high priority ones that you plan to move forward with, because there is starting to be a growing consensus around how, like the timing of how you would do that thoughtfully. And so therefore there's like the equity screen that would happen on your high priority ones that would further refine those based on what you are able to glean from the equity screen. And then an implementation schedule that speaks to how the scoring rubric would be applied at a later date as you think about implementing those actions. So I am really like between next Tuesday and next Wednesday with the equity consultant, I feel like the prioritization process will be very clear after that. And so that way, whether or not we focus on it at a subcommittee meeting based on other things you're working on or not, I think Marion and I will be able to provide direct guidance to subcommittees about the timing and nature of how to use the prioritization tool. So you guys have been really interested in that. So I encourage you, if you're still concerned about prioritization or have comments, that we'll talk about at a steering committee meeting on Tuesday afternoon, and encourage you to join. But I've gotten, it was, I thought, a really productive place that we landed with the council. Great conversation about how to use it and what to do with it. And then I've gotten some written feedback on it too that we've incorporated and been thinking about. And Marion's been great at pulling together some other examples from other climate action plans and thinking about definitions and things that could help guide us, as well as the hazard mitigation plan that Lauren was really critical in helping draft. So looking at examples and thinking about how to do it thoughtfully, and then how the work gets represented in the CAP.
All right.
I'll stop there.
Any quick questions there? And maybe we'll start to one more thing on decision rule and we'll dive in. Abby and Billy, do we want to take just a minute to talk about go back to the ground rules from, I don't know, last spring and just review the decision rule for the subcommittee? Abby and Billy, how do you want to handle that?
I absolutely do think that's really important as we move into this phase of beginning to need to figure out how to make decisions. And I had honestly completely forgotten that that was established. And so I think as a subcommittee, we need to cover that.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right, so I just put in chat what was just pulled out of the ground rules for subcommittees. So it says the subcommittees will operate by consensus, and essentially it was defined for the council. It's got details. I'm not going to copy that, but generally, concurrence doesn't mean you love every part of what you do. You have to kind of sometimes stomach things, but you try to help move forward as a group. And when someone disagrees, you really try to address that disagreement. But it does note that if disagreements can't be resolved by consensus, the fallback for subcommittees is then the council members of the subcommittee, which is a smaller subset of the subcommittee, then actually determine what to forward to the council. And then they can forward it in a number of ways, just recommendations that they think have most support, not necessarily 100%, and or they can put forward things, including some, kind of pros and cons of things that people disagree on. So that would be up to the council members of the subcommittee. So that was what was written, I think last spring even, about kind of how decisions are made. So questions about that, Jane?
Well, I have a question in particular, well, two clarifying points that I think will be really important. Both Ryan and Billy are designees of council members, so I just have a question on Ryan and Billy's role as official designees of councilors. And so that's just a question. I'm wondering as we move into this, or if it's just, are there only two council members?
That's tricky too, because
yeah,
Julie is on a subcommittee and Julie has 3 or 4 designees. And so Anson only has one, who is Ryan.
But Julie has 2. So yeah,
okay. Well,
yeah.
It is a question, Jane. I don't know.
I totally agree, Abby, though. That's a really good question, though, because then it's like she has 3 votes that are unequal to. Yeah,
sorry,
that's something the steering committee should just figure out.
Yes, I think the steering committee should figure it out too. We're going to talk about decision making with the steering committee on Tuesday, actually. So this is a good red flag to raise. So thank you.
Jane, I think we're asking for guidance regarding kind of proxies, so to speak, to how to handle that. Judy, you're doing it.
Yes, I specifically asked for clarification on consensus from Jane on the first meeting. And I defined it as the way I was raised using consensus with Native communities, which is we will keep discussing until we agree. And then the dissenting vote would be that person would agree to disagree to move it forward. And Jane, you said that's the way it was going to work.
I'm sorry if I misrepresented something, but I agree that my question and what we're going to talk about at the steering committee that is my understanding of consensus. I fully agree, but when and if we move from consensus to voting, which there is a process in the roadmap, that's my question is still, and guidance on how you move from consensus to voting, and when and if we're going to choose to do that.
Right, but there was no discussion of moving from consensus to voting.
That is
misrepresented that.
And also that is probably on Billy and I as well. I had my understanding, and Pat helped back me up on this, or Jane or whomever, this language is being pulled from the Climate Council and their documents, which
Right.
this is, again, I'm just gonna say, this is one of those impossible things with the timeline that we're on. Like, I hadn't even remembered that this existed. And so when Pat sent it out the other day, I knew that this would be an issue because I know that we've talked about consensus and that is how we're making decisions. So I'm not sure, Judy, I'm not sure how to resolve your understanding of it, which is, you know, a true consensus process with what this language is in the process documents tied into the Climate Council. I don't know where to go with that, but I do apologize for completely dropping the ball and having this misrepresented as a true consensus process within this committee when this language existed.
Well, it would have been nice to have known about this before we got to midstream.
I completely agree.
I'm sorry, but this does not feel equitable.
And here's one thought, which is to Judy's, I think, nice definition. I think we should go for that. And then if we do, like, if we do get to a person where we've done everything we can and there's still a person disagreeing, then the way we handle that person disagreeing is with respect, right? So do we forward their concern along with the recommendation? Do we forward, you know, a pro and con for the Climate Council to wrestle with? I think the key is when we have a disagreement and we're left there, I think a really important principle of consensus is treating the disagreement with respect, not overriding it. And how we express that respect is something we discuss. And when we get there, we figure out, right? It's not something you can necessarily name right now other than the principle. I mean, that would be my hope. If we get stuck, we get stuck. We'll have to talk it through.
I have another question, Pat.
Yeah, go for it.
Is there anything else that's been changed midstream that some other committee decided on that we've not been told about? I mean, this is pretty important
This was
change.
adopted before,
Yeah.
this was adopted before the subcommittees were actually formed. And so it was just a misrepresentation likely from me on how this next step from how we move from consensus to this when there's challenges like this.
This was from way back spring, right? Early on in the Climate Council's kind of ground rules or protocols.
So what's the answer to my question?
Judy, are you thinking of any?
I can't think of anything else right now that's changed, but or process documents that have been adopted, but we haven't worked on process in a while. But now that we're getting into the harder body of work, I think the process documents we're falling back on to remind ourselves of what the ground rules that were established.
Thank you.
Ryan, and then I want to maybe jump into our first substantive topic actually go through. Ryan.
Yeah, I'll keep it very short. I think as we move into this process, the pathways we discussed, I think we had pretty good consensus. And when we dig into the specifics, I think we need to acknowledge that we're going to have conflicts of implementation. And so at what level of agreement can we find consensus, and how can we flag a process for implementation once the climate action plan is implemented so that we can continue to wrestle with recommendations and implement them in an effective and equitable way. So that's just one thought I'm going to have just personally moving through this process and acknowledging for just a parallel process, the TMDL, many more people than in this group, right? We came to 8 specific recommendations from an ag working group that took 14 months. And now that we're digging into 180 specific recommendations across not just agriculture, but the whole natural and working land, I think we have to acknowledge the time crunch we're under and looking for at what level of consensus can we arrive. I hear in my head, you know, we don't want to plant platitudes. I don't think we want that. We want to be as specific as possible. But I see a real a challenge in the next 2 weeks, and don't want to set us up for failure in this process. So just sharing how I'm going to try to approach the next topic we're going to dig into. Thanks.
Very quickly, I just put in when we get to disagreement in the chat, different things people can do to try to be respectful of that disagreement. Abby, go ahead.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to, I mean, Iris and I are here, Ryan's here, Billy, if he is, like, I don't know how we're defining Billy in this process, but Billy is here. So that would be my recommendation. That would be my recommendation, that I certainly am not comfortable putting forward anything if we haven't achieved consensus that doesn't at the very least flag very clearly what the disagreements were. In other words, what we're putting forward, if there isn't consensus, it has to reflect what the disagreement was and why that we couldn't reach consensus around it.
And Judy just added one nice one too, so that's good. Nice. Okay. All right. So maybe it's again, and we know this will be a work in progress, and there'll be at times frustrating today. But I think we want to begin to dive in. But there's one thing we do want to kind of follow up, which is that last week we talked about this proposal to think differently about net emissions versus gross emissions accounting for agriculture. Ryan put together a piece he shared with everybody. I think people wanted a week to kind of just sit with that and decide if this group was comfortable forwarding that officially to the Vermont Climate Council. I know Abby and others raised it as an issue of concern last meeting. So I think we just wanted to see if people could consent to essentially the piece that Ryan wrote up and the recommendations in particular at the bottom that would be forwarded to the full Climate Council regarding net emissions inventory. So does anybody have any final questions or concerns about that proposal from last week? Billy.
Yeah, I think that the substance of working with science and data to ensure that the inventory is more detailed and responsive to kind of the emissions associated with particular ag practices and track that information going forward makes good sense to me, and I'm supportive of that. I'm somewhat wary of the form of the recommendation with all the whereas clauses. I think those conclusions are ones that are not, we haven't done anything like that, right? We haven't developed complex recommendations with a series of foundational whereases to get our points across. And that just makes me uncomfortable. And I haven't had the opportunity to go through all those whereases to kind of determine whether I agree with them or not. I'm not suggesting they're incorrect, but they just don't seem necessary. So I wonder if really what we should be doing is simply forwarding on the kind of substantive recommendation of that document to, revise the way that the inventory is calculated and leave it at that.
Well, let's do this. So Billy, I want to hold, I want to come back to that. So I'm asking Ryan to put in the chat that last 2 or 3 bullet points at the end of the document. And Judy, so you can take one more look at that, and others can too. So let's focus first on that, and we can come back to the form we submit. And Billy, to your good point. People take a minute to look at that. Thanks, Ryan, for putting that in there.
There's a missing sub A for the first bubble, the Vermont Climate Council. That should be a small a.
Okay.
And I do have one more comment once folks are done processing.
Okay, if I think, well, watching people's eyes to see if they're done reading, not sure. Billy, go ahead, you got a comment?
So my only other comment is in B. And B directs this, I think I'm reading this, directs the state to have an inventory that's capable at looking at the net emissions associated with agriculture and forestry. And again, I have no problem with that analysis. I just want to point out that the current GWSA does call for gross emissions reductions from sectors. So while I think accounting for net emissions is a fine and likely prudent task, that the requirement of the act is still focused on gross emissions reductions. So I just want to make sure that this recommendation doesn't run counter to the current law.
Ryan, can you speak to that?
Yeah, so Billy, I mean, I appreciate the whereas. This is the one time when drafting something where I always include citations for every point, but anyways, so I guess a question within this gross reduction, right? 10 VSA 578A of the Global Warming Solutions Act to direct the state of Vermont to measure and inventory greenhouse gas emissions pursuant to 10 VSA 582, and then have proportionate reductions based on that inventory for the sectors that are named in the law. And so in reading how the Global Warming Solutions Act directs the state to quantify emissions in the state, and then the specific statutory references for that emissions inventory, it appears to give discretion and directs natural resources to coordinate with other members of the administration and other agencies to quantify both emissions and sinks within sub A and B of 582. So I think that is just one part of this. Is you run into this talking point buzz. Oh, it's supposed to be growth. Maybe there's other sections of Global Warming Solutions Act, folks who want to raise to counter that, but I think it's potentially arguable about how the state conducts the inventory. There's some discretion in that, and I think the alignment with IPCC standards and the transition from LU LUCF to AF LOU, right? Ag, forestry, and other land use, AF OLU. There's some gaps I think that exist, and I think that's what the whereases are attempting to raise with the framework that's been laid out. I think the other points that are made in there, just to try to break off that, is the proportionate reduction. We're talking about that AF ag, forestry, and other land use from the 2006 IPCC amendment that arguably puts those land uses together in a net quantification, and 582 appears to give the latitude for not only updates but also to define how that inventory is conducted. So sorry to belabor that point, but perhaps folks can point to other references to the Global Warming Solutions Act, and it's definitely contestable, but I think there's a number of reasons why it should be considered and elevated. Thanks.
Billy, I don't know whether that addressed your concern or not.
I don't know. My only point is that I think the act is calling for gross reductions, right? So if we inventory them on that, I think that's fine, but I think we can do both. And I just want to understand if this is a proposal to change the requirements of the act as they apply to the ag sector for gross emissions reductions, or if this is acknowledging that is the requirement currently, and that we're still recommending that we do a net inventory going forward. That's a fine outcome for me to say, hey, we want to do this differently in the future, while still acknowledging the current requirements of this law.
The way I read it, Ryan, is the language is very focused on the inventory. It doesn't necessarily speak to the implications of that inventory in terms of.
No, there are implications in the current inventory that need to be addressed. Sorry, Ryan, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm looking to the greenhouse gas reduction requirements, section 3 of the Global Warming Solutions Act, right? It says shall reduce emissions as measured and inventoried pursuant to section 582 of Title 10. And so those reductions are then set at 40% of 1990, 80% of 1990, 26 of 2005. And so those reductions are meant to be made based on the inventory for which there's discretion and direction to update and look at both emissions and sinks within Section 582 of Title 10. So that I don't know where gross appears in that specific emission reduction requirement section. So that's all the, not to go back to that, but I don't know where it says gross in there, or there isn't a latitude to amend the process to ensure that the inventory is as congruent as possible with international standards and some of the gaps that have been identified in this process. So that's a two-part argument, I suppose.
So it seems to me there are implications, as Abby just said, for if the inventory is changed, then decisions based on it then would potentially change too in terms of allocation. Let me go to Judy.
I'm still back on basic questions. So when we're talking about agriculture, how are you defining that? I know people who farm and make a living off a half-acre land and call themselves a farmer. I also know the 100 acres I have, I leave in its natural state under conservation, but I live in an area zoned agriculture. So what are we talking about here? When we're talking agriculture, are we talking about the half-acre farm? Are we talking about the 100-acre that a landowner owns that just sits there? What are we talking about?
I think there's two parts to this. One is, what is the state of Vermont inventorying for emissions? And then the second one is, what are going to be the outcomes of the climate action plan for those that are engaged in land use practices that are associated with those emissions? At this time, the agricultural sector, as inventoried by the state of Vermont emissions inventory, which uses the EPA SIT tool, focuses on enteric fermentation from livestock, manure management emissions, emissions from the soil, and then utilization of lime and fertilizer. And so those four sources are what is quantified in the inventory. However, as we know from the Global Warming Solutions Act, in my opinion, this subcommittee is tasked with looking at a much broader intersection of agriculture and natural and working land. And so for the purposes of implementation, there's a number of different threshold criteria or definitions of when something is farming or when something is agriculture. I think for the purposes of this the subcommittee, we would largely get to define what we intend to have climate action plan recommendations apply to, or how the strategies could be applied. So I think, Judy, from my program, agriculture has threshold criteria below which you probably don't want to be regulated by the program. It doesn't mean someone isn't farming. It's just not jurisdictional farming for environmental rules with the REPs, and it's delegated to town. And then you look at current use, look at 250, like there's a number of different ways that the state defines what is farming, but I think the Agriculture Ecosystem Subcommittee certainly has the latitude to make recommendations that apply to different scales and types of farming. And I think we're trying really hard to quantify and keep all of those different sizes and scales as part of our considerations when we're working to make these recommendations.
Well, shouldn't larger, whatever, landowners also be concerned about gas emissions? And
you mean fossil fuel use?
And the storage of carbon? Yeah, all of that. Because, I mean, where I live, everybody has these huge chunks of land, and for the most part, nobody farms it. But that doesn't mean they don't rototill it under every year.
I don't know if I have a response to that. I mean, private landowners make private decisions provided it complies with state requirements. I don't think many folks just till. It's very expensive to get to turn sod over.
Well,
time
there's a lot
intensive,
of
but-
gentlemen, there's a lot of gentlemen farmers here who have a tractor and they just love to go out there and sit and ride on their tractor and turn the soil over so it doesn't move into the next, layer field of succession, whatever. And my point is that we're skipping over the urgency here. And if we're going to say to a half-acre farmer, you have to do this, this, and this, but to a 300-acre landowner, you don't have to do anything, there's a problem there.
So I want to be on just the top. Abby, go ahead. Yeah.
I don't think that's what's happening. I think what Ryan's trying, and admittedly, the inventory is still very confusing to me, but I believe my understanding of it is that agriculture is qualified based on the certifications required for the required agricultural practices. In other words, large farms, medium farms, certified small farms, and small farms. And so the folks that you're talking about they currently aren't under regulations. Is that a fair?
Right, but the town plays in there. So like I said, I'm zoned agriculture, haven't done anything to the land, but next door, my neighbor is farming with chickens and guinea hens and geese and ducks and turkeys and all these other things. And there's no set of rules for them do you see what I'm saying?
So I
And
think
so
that-
they just keep cutting down more of the forest, and they put one more fowl in there.
So let me separate out the inventory from Judy. Some of your concerns about how would programs and other things we're going to talk about apply or not apply to farms at the farm scale and also the size of the farm.
Well, I'm looking for a definition for agriculture.
Right. And Ryan, I guess, is there a definition that's typically used in the inventory already that we can just name so we all understand?
I'm not sure if it's defined. I mean, it is within the tool for the land uses, but I think we'd want to look more broadly at what the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee is looking at, which are many more types of land uses on farms that complement or perhaps aren't fully captured in the inventory. So we can work on this definition. My definition is threshold criteria of the required ag practices. That's what throws farms into all of the requirements for the state and the associated exemptions from other programs. So that's making $2,000 a year, 4 acres, having a plan to start a farm, are three of the broad categories. Someone could be.
So I'm aware of our time, and I'm a little worried about this swamping us for other things we need to do. So let me take John and David's hands up, and then I think we need to figure out how to proceed or not with this because we're running out of time. So John.
Well, I don't want to prolong this. I mean, I just, what Judy's mentioning about her town, she's in an agricultural sector, has actually nothing to do with it. Just says it's just the town voting that agriculture can be allowed in that part of town. It doesn't mean that there are necessarily farms in that part of town. There may well be farms, but I do think it's an interesting point that there may be landowners out there who have large tracts of land who don't farm under the definition that they're not making $2,000 a year, and they may farm 300 acres. They may own, 300 acres. That's an interesting thing. How big how much of that takes place in Vermont, I don't know. I mean, but it just raises, and it does raise to me a slightly interesting point.
If they have more than 4 acres used for farming, they're under the threshold criteria, regardless of whether they're or not.
Right, I agree. But if they don't have livestock and they're not growing crops and they're not grazing anything, they're just playing on their little Kubota out there, and they can afford to do that. And it can have an environmental impact. But I'm sorry, this is really to coin a phrase, getting down in the weeds.
Yeah, I want to, David, last point on this, we got to decide how to act one way or the other. So, David.
Patrick, I think we should take a minute to get to the core of the issue, because I feel like we've been distracted into a discussion about agriculture definition that's not to the point of this recommendation. The recommendation goes to the question of how do we account for the work that's being done. And we're making a set of recommendations, a bunch of them that relate to ecosystems, services like wetlands and natural systems restoration, forest restoration, and agricultural practices. And Billy's point was the statute drives the state towards considering gross emissions primarily. And what my fear is that all of our recommendations that relate to how we improve the ability of the land to hold and store carbon are going to get lost. It doesn't matter whether we call it agriculture or we call it something else. What matters is that the modelers who are evaluating what the kind of net emissions are and taking into account all of the storage and benefits of recommendations that we've been making, that we have greater, more sustainable farming practices, increased forest, better forest management, increased investment in ecosystems. All those things store and sequester carbon, and we need models that account for that. And then, so I think that's a core issue that we should decide whether we're in consensus on or not. And what the definition of agriculture is not relevant to that. So it's not directly relevant. And then the second piece is that if there's a question that by somehow measuring and evaluating and giving the public and the legislature and policymakers information about how much carbon benefits, how many climate benefits there are associated with all these practices, then if that's somehow in conflict with the law, then we should recommend that the law be changed. And that's easy to put into our recommendation. We can just say it that way. We're like saying, we're not trying to change the law here. We're just saying we think that the process should recognize this whole set of benefits.
That's fine with me, David. I'm totally supportive of that approach.
So let me just, David put us, I modified it, David, slightly, but there's a simple formulation of Ryan's maybe more complex formulation, which I just put in the chat, which is Florida recommendation, the GWSA should be amended to allow for the accounting of carbon storage and sequestration for agriculture and forestry. Ryan, I know that's not a concise, not a clear formulation.
Yeah, I would just add mitigation, right, or emission reduction. We currently can't count emission reduction from ag practices. That is separate from sequestration and storage, which are important to, I think, quantify all three.
Okay, so
but why, Patrick, would we not also recommend that the state do the modeling? There's nothing, honestly, there's nothing in the law that prevents the state from evaluating the net benefits of carbon storage and sequestration now. We don't need an amendment of the law to that. I'm just saying, I think your language is fine as a kind of secondary recommendation, but the primary recommendation is along the lines of what Ryan put forward, which is we should right now evaluate what are the ways to strengthen the sophistication of our models.
Yeah, to put a finer point on it, the problem with the way that the greenhouse gas inventory is being conducted right now, per Dr. Galford and her looks into this, is that, and God, I wish Alyssa was here too. We do not have the ability through the SIT tool to properly capture the distinctions in management and feed, et cetera, that are calculating those emissions, those sectoral emissions to which were being calculated. The SIT tool is extremely coarse. It doesn't allow for details in how it's calculating that. So all of the work that, I'm gonna say it, a farmer like I have done to try to get to a better place and to try to do things that do reduce emissions. We've been feeding seaweed for 10 years, all those different things. None of that is captured currently in the sectoral emission as it lives. To me, that is an enormous equity issue. It doesn't appropriately capture the work that the farmers have already done and where they're actually at. It's taking more national level data and non-specific to Vermont data sets and coarse numbers to establish where Vermont's farmers are, which does not accurately represent where Vermont's farmers are, which seems like an enormous issue to me. If it doesn't seem like an enormous issue to the rest of you, I'm not going to say fine, but no, let's note that. Let's note that, and we can move along. But I think, if that helps you understand all of the complexity, I think if that helps you simplify it, that's where it's come to for me. Ryan and I have been working on this for 9 months, and I have I've dove really deep in this.
Okay. Billy,
And let me jump in there
So-
because I agree with you. I started all this, right? Like I absolutely agree. We need to update the inventory to be at the level of detail that you just articulated. Absolutely. And I support that completely. My only concern was whether this was also an effort to change what I perceived the reductions from baseline were in the GWSA. Those are two separate things. I 100% support updating
They're
the
not-
inventory.
If the baseline isn't currently accurate, that is an issue as well. So that is my problem as well, which I can't really get to an answer on. And we don't have, I don't believe we have the expertise gathered today to figure that out. But
Right, and
sure,
I just-
if we
that-
could
that
at least
seems like
agree
a
that
much-
moving forward, we need to adapt to schools.
So I'm not going to stand in the way of this. I just wanted to share that concern.
all right. So Billy, with that, then I think, Bill, you're willing to, so I want to go back to Ryan's more specific language rather than me trying to formulate on the fly too broad. So is there anyone who can't live with the language around thinking differently about the inventory that we put in chat with its various clauses? With the amendment, can we add forestry to sections, I think 1 and 2, as a few folks suggested? I think Ryan only refers to ag, so we would add ag and forestry in those sections. Is there anybody who can't live with this recommendation going forward as described in chat with the addition of forestry in section A? Judy, say more. Judy, you're on mute.
How can we move forward with ag this and ag that, and we don't have a definition of ag? I know, David, you said it doesn't matter, but it does to me. It matters to me because, like John put in the thing, some of these large landowners are letting their land be farmed by somebody else. So we've got to consider these large landowners somehow in the definition of what ag is, or because they're making an impact on what's stored and what's released.
Judy, I believe the inventory will account for that. I mean, remember the inventory is pretty
I
broad.
know people keep saying, I believe, I think.
Right. So Judy, let me just, so if you feel we need more time, then we need to get a definition of ag. Someone need to develop that. I do want to be clear about the implications. So as long as this group can't forward this recommendation, the inventory will not account for sequestration and storage for ag and forestry. Because at the Climate Council, what's happening is that other committee is moving that inventory forward fast, asking for approval at the council, and it doesn't account for this recommendation right now.
Is anybody accounting for large landowners?
Can someone, here's and Judy, this is the proposition I'm going to make, and then you're right, it's just this propositions I need someone to verify, right? My understanding is both in the work we're doing in specific recommendations here we're going through, as well as even the inventory, it accounts for agriculture, whether it's large or small, whether it's fallow or actively farmed, and actually how it's farmed. At least that's the intent. But that's my proposition. If I'm wrong, please someone correct me.
If I understand Judy's point, your concern is that somehow we're letting people off the hook.
Yes.
That's, I think, when I said it didn't matter, I didn't mean it doesn't matter at all. It definitely matters in the context of our recommendations as they're specific to directing how landowners behave. I'm suggesting it's not necessary for us to even, frankly, to define it or limit ourselves to agriculture in the context of the inventory. We're just asking, when we have a recommendation, for instance, that we invest in the restoration of wetlands, or that we improve soil practices, and that we subsidize, better forest practices, right? We're suggesting, what I would hope that this language is suggesting is that the modelers that are developing the inventories take all of those benefits into account. So it should, maybe we, instead of just saying agricultural sector, it says for evaluating, carbon storage and sequestration benefits of better land management practices in the state, including agriculture, forestry, and natural systems, something like that. That it doesn't constrain it to just agriculture. And the point is really, we're more trying to capture as a measurement tool, what are the benefits of investing in better agricultural management? And then Judy, your point, when we get to recommendations that are specific about what we're requiring farmers to do in the agricultural sector in terms of regulatory or where we're investing, we should absolutely be being specific about who's included in that definition.
Exactly, because I have been seeing people come here as second homeowners and buy up farms. And they're using them very different than the way we look at the definition of a farm. And do we want these people who are buying these second homes farms to be treated differently than the farmer who's struggling with half an acre of farm?
So co-chairs, I need some direction on how you want to proceed with the definitional question here in the application.
Yeah, I guess I would just say, I don't think this is how the inventory works. I think the inventory looks at land uses and practices and calculates the emissions associated with it. It doesn't look at who is doing those things.
So we don't need agriculture in there then? Is that what you're saying?
No, there's a whole suite of agricultural land uses that is considered. And I think Ryan's proposal is to consider them in a more kind of granular and detailed way. But it's really just looking at how the land is being used and actions thereupon, and not necessarily who is kind of the owner of that land.
Sonia, if you have a clarification for definition, that would be great. Sonia, you had your hand up, so I'm assuming maybe that's your intent.
Yeah, I haven't been really involved with this, and I've also, coming from an outside perspective on this question, I was wondering if I could just kind of try to reflect back what I understand the question that this proposal is, to try to see if I have the right understanding, and thought maybe that might help understanding the subcommittee.
Go for it.
Okay, as I think this is the current emissions inventory is basically some super high level thing that takes like number of acres in agriculture and multiplies it by something, a number of cows and multiplies it by something. And then it comes up with a number and says, this is how much agriculture is emitting. Something vague, high level, and doesn't take into account that what's actually happening on the ground on those farms, right? And I understand that this proposal is saying, okay, that's good, but that's not good enough. Cover cropping is different than not cover cropping. No-till is different than plowing. Can we get those more detailed nuances into this inventory in order to A, see where we're at now, and B, if in the future people are doing more of those types of activities, we can actually account for them. Whereas under the current model, the only way to reduce emissions would be to either reduce land in agriculture or number of cows. Is that accurate to what this proposal is?
Yes, thank you, Sonia. I think that captures our thinking well, although I'll let Ryan go because he would know better than I.
Yeah, no, Sonia, I think that's a good summary. And what I have here is the IPCC structure of reporting for agriculture, forestry, and other land uses that I can put up that provides the categories that we are suggesting be included in the state inventory, which includes forest land, entire fermentation, manure management, cropland, grassland, wetlands, settlements, and then the aggregate sources based on ag emissions and land cultivation separate from land use change and management. And so IPCC puts all of that under agriculture, forestry, and other land uses. And through the work of the subcommittee, I think I've heard from many folks that the carbon inventory is meant to look at this as using one tool, and the recommendation put forth by Subtask Group 5C is to look at not only XAC and SIT, but a review of other models, particularly one that California uses that is more discrete, modeling of land uses in Vermont. Vermont to try to get the most comprehensive accounting that allows the management that Abby spoke to that farmers are utilizing to be part of the balance and quantification of agriculture or all those land uses, right? Even though forestry doesn't have an explicit emission reduction requirement from the Global Warming Solutions Act. So that's part one. And then the second part, Billy, to answer your question, is I do think there's an explicit opportunity within how the law is structured and how the emissions inventory can be conducted that subtext group 5C is asking for that to be reevaluated because we can redo an inventory or have parallel inventories, but unless there's some movement in which I think that the law has passed does have some discretion in there. But looking at both of those things are, I think, the two options on the table, and the one that I pasted into the chat that's A, sub 1 and 2, I think is the most salient for an RFI, which would be enlisting a contractor to do a deep dive of literature review, not into the whole emissions inventory, which the ESG looked at, but narrowly and specifically into the agriculture, forestry, and other land uses, which would include wetlands, forestry, and agriculture in that process.
Okay, so to Charlie's point, we do need to, again, I'm just aware of time. So, well, that's always our struggle here. So I think we've described, so I try to give us a kind of a broad reflection. We have language from Ryan. It's been suggested that we add forests and maybe other natural lands like wetlands into the words. So we've talked about the definition, Judy, as best we can, at least for today. So I guess I want to test one more time, whether with the additions of forests and other sort of natural lands, we can go ahead and forward this recommendation or not. So want to give people, again, anybody who feels that they can't live with that as amended, please note the dissent. And if that's where we are, that's where we're going to be for the moment. So Judy, I don't know whether you feel satisfied with the conversation about definitions and broad scale pictures or not at this point.
I feel better. I just need to know that someplace, somewhere, these large landowners are going to be considered.
And I think then that's an important kind of for all the things we look at in terms of activities or actions, are we thinking about these kinds of ownership that you're concerned about? So it needs to be forefront on our mind. Okay. Anybody else? So Judy, are you okay with this thing going forward with that consideration? Thank you. Anybody else have a dissent at this point?
I guess my initial comment stands. I 100% support doing the inventory better going forward. I still have large questions about the implications on whether this is changing the standard in the act. We're not going to answer that today. I have no problem. So this should just go forward with that comment.
Okay, so we know Judy's concerned about kind of like land ownership and scale of farm, and we know you're concerned about its actually implications overall for the original intent of the act.
But 100% agree that as we come up with a new methodology for the inventory, it should be tracking all this information.
Okay, so I think with those concerns noted, it sounds like then the recommendations amended for both forestry and other natural lands can go forward to the council, and then maybe Ryan, I think one other thing to clarify, I think the whereas statements, I'm going to take Billy's point that we kind of put those aside and focus on the core recommendations. Certainly that's supplemental material, but unless Ryan, you feel really strongly, I think keeping it simpler is better. It's complicated enough as it is. So if we could focus on those core recommendations as amended, and then the whereas is kind of background information if people need it, just to kind of finalize that point too. Ryan, can you live with that?
I have no attachment. I drafted at the request of the group and attempted to make the background information, which are talking points to and pieces of information and potentially supporting reasons for why this recommendation was made. I would encourage folks to read them, but certainly the recommendation is the important part of it. I think that we've gotten to a good space, and we're going to strike the whereases, so be it.
And then I think what would be good is if we could, if you could forward, I think that document's now posted, but maybe co-chairs, you can work with Ryan to just finalize the language. We can share it with the subcommittee shortly after early next week. And so it's available then to the full council. Okay. All right. So we have concurrence on moving forward with 2 concerns noted, and appreciate that. And some things we need to note, particularly going forward on land ownership. Okay. I'm going to suggest we try at least to start in on our matrix, recognizing that we're going to need to take a break in a little bit and also provide for public comment. So Is that okay if we dive into our first one? Co-chairs? Okay. All right. So I'm going to share my screen. So hopefully, let me do one thing. Okay. So here's just a little bit of background to make sure people are clear on the process here. We'll dive into the substance. Marley took all of your good comments. You submitted comments via Excel or Word, line by line, with comments, issues, doubts, new ideas. And then Marley took all of that good work, and God bless her, pulled all that together and then put it into the matrix that was sent out late yesterday afternoon, which tried to kind of just capture all those essentially by ID number, by line item in the original big matrix, by the action, and then the comment. And it was captured in kind of questions, disagreements, and missing items. And sometimes the questions and the disagreements kind of merge together, so it's hard to keep those separate. And then equity was infused throughout there that came up across a number of the comments. So then what I did imperfectly, but to get us focused today, was I took all that and I tried to create slides going in kind of sequence of the ID number to have us focus in on what I think are the outstanding questions, issues, equity, disagreement, and or new things to add per kind of big topics. So I didn't capture everything. There's a lot of really good detail about redundancy and some language changes that we won't necessarily get to today. So when we get as far as we can today, we'll have to decide what to do with this thing going forward, especially given the timeline that Jane described to us. But let's not worry about that now. Let's worry about that at 11:45. So with that, let me project the first one, which is renewables. And this is, again, just in the order that it kind of shows up in the matrix. And note these things. The issues that, as I saw, that came up in your guys' comments were that there was a bit of a debate about on-farm solar. There was some concern that it shouldn't be rewarded anymore. The net metering already rewards it, so don't single it out. There was concern that you would actually be eating up farmland, so maybe we should actually support sort of building-based solar on farm, but not solar on land. And we had a whole other potential idea for a strategy to kind of be more focused on solar on farm, on tracking various things and involving various ways. So it's probably a little hard to read the slide because it's fine grained, but that was the issues I heard. So I think we need to kind of discuss it and decide what you want to do about recommendations for on-farm solar. So I think now's up for discussion.
I can start. To try to just give an example, we're currently net metered for our solar system. We have a 38 kilowatt array on our rooftop on our farm. And the concern or the issue that I have run into is in the framework of equity. And then this is, again, one of those tricky things where, the methane digesters count as an emission reduction, I think, because of the manure component, but on-farm solar isn't recognized in any way as an emission reduction that assists, that goes into the electrification reduction versus, anyway. My concern is that net metered as we are, there is no incentive to add more panels for us because, we bought the we did a REAP grant for this. So what is, farms tend to have rooftop infrastructure, which with my conversations with Liz Miller at GMP, is honestly their preferable method for solar as well versus needing to disrupt soil. And there's no incentive for rooftop over land disruption. When we're net metered, there's no incentive to add more panels, even if you can, to add more renewable energy to the grid, which seems to me to be sort of missing the point. Don't we want people to be producing more renewable power, or do we not? And if we do want people to be producing more renewable power, particularly in a farm context, particularly in a small farm context where diversification is pretty necessary, could that be another diversification stream potentially? And farms who are eligible for cow power, which is again something that's only available to large farms, they are able to make a small amount of money off of the cow power. I don't have that ability as a small farmer. That seems like something we would potentially want to address. So that's where some of the thoughts around on-farm solar were when we put forward that action. I don't know if that actually answers that question, but that's what I got.
Other comments or thoughts on kind of on-farm solar or renewables, David Mears?
I'm not quite sure, Abby, if I'm meeting you in terms of your point, but maybe you could help me understand. I have a concern about incentivizing the conversion of cropland or even marginal farmland that would be a wetland to solar, or to things that are incompatible with using it for agriculture, and then we lose the benefits of the agricultural land to our economy and ecology. So that's in terms of incentivizing solar on non-cropland or non-arable land. I'm all for it. My concern was about I feel like we're seeing way too much solar pop up on on marginal farmland or land that wants to be wetlands.
You and I are in complete agreement on that. So my point is more, how do we, if we need more renewable power, if farms have roofs, for example, that can take solar power, why aren't we creating some type of a program or system where that becomes more possible than these, I'm going to say it, solar farms, which is something I struggle a little bit with, to your point.
So just to be clear, the current net metered rule and incentive structure does incentivize rooftop solar over greenfield solar in almost all instances. So there is like this whole preferred site structure and larger net metered projects need to be on those preferred sites. So that does exist in kind of law and stat, or not law, but in rule right now. It's less impactful at the smaller scale, like where you're at, Abby, but for systems like 150 to 500 kW for net metering, they can't net meter unless they're on one of the defined preferred sites, which include rooftops, parking lots, brownfields, landfills, things of that nature, or on the land of the owner, the primary off-taker of the energy.
So John, go for it. John and then Alyssa.
Just a quick point. When I was on the Land Trust Board, they had a policy that limited farmers who had easements from generating more power by solar than they actually used on the farm, i.e. they could not export power. They could not diversify by exporting power. I don't think they've changed that policy. I think they should change their policy. So it just a comment that that should happen. Thank you.
Alyssa, then Jake.
Great. Yeah. So I'm thinking one of the clear recommendations for an action based on what I'm hearing is that we should increase outreach and maybe some incentives for on-farm solar installation to be preferred on existing built infrastructure. Even if that's just like an outreach or a campaign, that maybe that could achieve part of the goal of what Abby was describing.
Right, Jake.
Yeah, building off of what Alyssa just said, and Billy's clarification too is just it raises the question of, is the incentive for the preference to be on rooftop significant enough? And then just another issue that comes up with ag infrastructure is that sometimes there needs to be capital improvements to the structure itself to support large solar installations. So there may be kind of a gap there that is preventing access to the existing incentive in that way. So maybe there needs to be some kind of capital investment fund for on farm, on building solar installation that can close that gap.
I wonder if, look at that, someone had written kind of a new strategy, which I'm just kind of adding to. So I wonder if 12 might be replaced by this thing here, which essentially talks about collecting data to get the baseline, understanding the complexity of net metering, educating about those programs, doing outreach, as Alyssa said, and then rewarding and supporting renewables that essentially don't take away land for farming or working or natural lands. I wonder if this new strategy could be the thing that we forward and kind of replace 12 with. You know, wording can be worked out, and you know, we can fix the wording later, but the general idea. And then we get at, I think, a number of things people have raised.
I like the new strategy, particularly if it would allow us. I like anything that has track in it. I keep feeling like we continue to come up against these real data gaps in our understanding of where we're currently at. And so I really like having that in there. I also, yeah, and appropriately reward. Yeah, because to John's point, it could be a potential. It fundamentally doesn't make sense to me that we need more renewable energy, and this is something that small farmers could do on rooftops, and they also can't get any money for it. So we could make more power, but why would we take out the loan to put on more panels when, I mean, there's a certain point at which farmers can't just do the right thing because it's the right thing. I know that sounds terrible, but economics are economics.
Alyssa, did you want to add any other language to what I have in this new strategy and its actions right now?
I actually was just thinking that I wonder if there's a role for regulation here to require that there's a review of the capacity for built infrastructure to house solar before allowing field scale installations. But I'm not familiar enough with the logistics of whether or not that would be a big challenge. I also agree with Abby and Jake that having a fund or financial incentives as part of that is really critical.
Judy.
I don't know if this belongs here or not, but in all this discussion about adding solar panels, there's a shortage of electricians in this state, and there's a gap in the age. Most of the ones that are still there are old. And also the people who teach the electricians, there's a shortage of educators, and there's a shortage of inspectors. So that whole area has to be looked at seriously before we, or it could be a strategy, I guess, or an action to go with this. Because you can't keep saying more solar panels and more solar panels if you don't have somebody to wire them.
Does anybody know if cross-sector addressed workforce issues like Judy just named, Charlie?
Yeah, I believe that we have some workforce related things in our spreadsheet. So we might just want to take Judy's really good comment and flag it. And then when we get to that section, address it there. Because I think it's spot on, but I think there's a broader bucket of workforce development stuff we can kind of look at there.
I'm going to put it in chat to note it, Judy, so we don't lose it. So I'm going to put it right there, so it's there, and maybe it goes back into some of our workforce stuff that comes out later on.
Just to jump in, following up on Charlie's spot on, where workforce is one of those sort of cross-cutting themes that we've initially identified. That Jane spoke about this at the Climate Council meeting, but there needs to be some work because there's workforce items across the board for all of the subcommittees that are developing actions. So some way to sort of note that either with an indicator and keep it under the specific strategies, but kind of have a roll up at the beginning about the importance of workforce across the board. So I think noting it is good, and then continuing to flag them and keep them where they are, because I think they should be addressed across the pathways.
Right. Okay. So I think, again, what we'd like to do is take this new strategy. We may need to do some wordsmithing, and then this new strategy would essentially replace, with its various actions or ideas, would then essentially replace number 12. Okay. Anybody concerned about doing that? we're going to come back at the end to talk about how we finesse and refine the matrix as a whole. So that's a question that still lingers. So I just want to note that, but this we're generally trying to capture the agreement here, and then we'll figure out how to translate it. Okay. Anybody disagree with this approach? Otherwise, we're going to move to the next. And I know the print is not huge, understatement. Okay. So there's a number of things here. Should we keep going, co-chairs? You want to take a break? Public comment? How do you want to do this?
What's the will of the people? How you feeling?
Break. I heard some people go break. 5 minutes.
Sure.
Sure. Yep.
So it's 10. I have a 10:20 now. So 10:25 we'll return, and then co-chairs, if you want to do a quick public comment, let me know whenever you want to do that. So everybody take a bio break. Come back at 10:25. Okay. And I'll leave the screen up so you can look at it.
I guess this was the day where it started early.
Hey, Cheryl, I did. We started at 8:30.
Oh, is my voice on?
It
Sorry.
is, but that's
Sorry
me.
about that.
No worries. I'm answering your question. No worries. Thanks a lot. I'll go on mute.
Okay.
I'll go on mute as well for a minute. All right, we're getting close. So if subcommittee members could pop back on their video so we know you're there. Let's probably try to get started. And in a second, what I want to do is take a brief public comment, and I want to turn it back to Billy. So now we just want to take a quick moment for public comment. So folks who want to make a public comment, just put your hand signal up, and then we can call on you. And then after that, I'll turn it back to Billy for just a few thoughts as co-chair. So Jennifer and Cheryl. Okay, Jennifer, how about you go first?
Thank you. I just wanted to comment on the idea of the on-farm, on-building solar and echo what Abby and Alyssa and others had to say about it, and emphasize an education piece of that. On our farm, we have panels on barn, on the house, and are able to counter most of our electricity needs, and we're grid intertied, so we send it back. In all honesty, I'm sure that there are incentives that we missed out on, and we need to add more panels, and so it would be great to have those opportunities. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer, so much. Cheryl and Zach. Cheryl, go ahead.
Okay, sorry about that.
No,
I feel similarly to a lot of people. And one thing that I think is important is that when talking about, solar panels and other alternative energy installations, we think a lot about the need for reducing energy use and bring that up each time, because I think that is a part of what needs to happen. We can't just continue to just replace our energy needs with a different form of energy. We have to reduce the energy use as well. And I believe that, again, not just on farms, but on all buildings, all new buildings, they should all be available for solar use, and any new development of any type, and including things that are coming up, like the roads. Sometimes I've heard about in the past, but don't know right now what's going on with that, and roof shingles and things like that. Let's see. So that should be here in the farm area, in the agriculture area as well.
Thank you, Cheryl. Zach.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Zach Porter, Conservation Law Foundation. I just, at this point, just wanted to make a request that as quickly as possible, I'm guessing somebody's working on this, maybe it's Marion or Marley, that the revised spreadsheet gets shared in some way that the public can look at it. Last week, it took a while to get the first version of that up for folks to look at, and now we're kind of behind again, not having access to that. So I just request that as quickly as possible that's shared, or else the value of the conversation today is really diminished dramatically. So CLF is preparing comments actually on the older version that will be into you shortly in writing, and I look forward to commenting later today at the other opportunities on this most recent kind of version of the spreadsheet. But thank you for your help.
Zach, I know this probably doesn't help very much, but this is an unfortunate factor of the insane deadline we're under. We only got it, I think, yesterday at 4, the full subcommittee. So you're not much behind us. I think we're all really struggling to take all of this in as quickly as we can, and to, move as efficiently as possible. So we'll certainly do everything possible that we can to get it to the public as quick as possible. But I just want to assure you that you're not that far behind us as the subcommittee either.
Thanks, Abby. Yeah, and I guess that my question would just be why, when that's shared with the subcommittee, why it wouldn't also be put up on the website immediately, just as a matter of practice, so that we don't get into this situation again. But that only seems fair, especially because the public can't participate in any kind of the sub breakout conversations that are happening, off this screen on Friday mornings. So that should happen, concurrently. When it goes out to the subcommittee, it should go out to the public. Anyways, I appreciate your concern. I know you're trying to do the best you can with the timeline.
We can certainly look into that further.
Thanks, Zach. John.
Yeah, hi, y'all. John Braidman, Regulatory Affairs Director at Vermont for Clean Environment, and also a farmer, forest land owner, and farmer of hay. I don't know if the committee, I've not been participating or following you all that closely this summer, but I don't know how deeply your committee has dug into the current use program and what can be strengthened to achieve many of the goals that you all are seeking. Clearly keeping land open, farmland rather than developed land, keeping forest lands intact, and managing for ecosystem diversity. And I think the long-term current use, kind of like minimum wage, needs to be updated and maybe needs to be keyed to some kind of economic factor. I don't know, cost of living or something, because and I'm seeing this in my neighborhood in Calais. We are feeling the siege that's being felt across Vermont, and lands that I thought were more or less going to stay in farming and forest are getting chopped up despite being in current use, because the disincentives to that kind of conversion are inadequate, and likely the incentives to stay in are also inadequate. So to the extent that we're going to roll out a major program to address climate change, and a lot of what we're seeking is keyed to Vermont staying Vermont as we know it, in terms of wildlands, forest lands, farmlands. The hundreds of millions of dollars, frankly, that are going to be pumped into the overarching program, there needs to be a piece of that going into current use. Current use has, every year it's a big conversation. How much can you put into current use? And ultimately, like pensions, it's a big dollar amount, and the legislature finds itself struggling to fund it and constrained in terms of expanding the program in a better direction. So I would suggest that be taken into serious consideration. It's one of our most successful, if not the most successful program for keeping Vermont a farming and forest land state. Thank you.
Thanks, John. And thanks all for public comment. Appreciate it. Billy, over to you.
Thank you. I was just trying to help get that spreadsheet posted. But so everyone, this has been a good dialogue so far. We're going to continue working through the matrix. I just wanted to put a recommendation out there for you all to consider that we've long discussed that not every single one of these actions will be implemented as part of the first climate action plan that comes out this year. And that plan is going to be updated every 4 years. There's opportunity for work to kind of continue during the pendency of each plan. So for issues like the last one we just had, we may want to consider recommendations along the lines of research opportunities to achieve X goal, or basically direct action to get the information we need to make this kind of ultimate action more informed and happen in the future. So, something along the lines of, research opportunities to better incentivize on-farm solar at scale, something like that. So I think just keep that in the back of your mind, that we can have actions to do work to inform future actions. And that's just as important as things that are going to be implemented in year one. So, that may be a good way for us to keep ideas on the table, keep momentum going, but have resources put towards investigation and research that will be necessary to kind of actually inform the ultimate act. So that was all I wanted to share right now, Pat.
Good. I'm actually just adding that to our badly spelled back to our recommendation there. Okay, so the next, oh, Charlie, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow. I think Billy's spot on, and that's a note that I've had here is we've got things around research and finding metrics and how we track and measure success built into a number of our existing strategies. And just want to flag that we may want to actually create a new strategy around just that, that we can couch these under. So I don't know where we can talk about that, but just want to flag that for conversation. Thanks.
Good. So Charlie, just kind of keep that. Let's, when we circle back to at 11:45 to what's next, just please come back to that as maybe a potential action item. So, okay. So next, these are actually, there's three separate things here. So, but I stuck on one side. So the first one is on, there's a recommendation for climate feed management program, including feed amendments. And there was some concern about equity, what that means for markets, all of those things. It wasn't necessarily a disagreement, but I just wasn't sure whether people are okay with the recommendation or we need to do more about it. But it's the climate feed management program. You can see the comments off to the right if you can read my, screen in your exhausted eyes. So I don't know whether people want to whether this is okay or if you want to raise any final questions about it.
Just a quick comment, Pat. I think it should be emphasized that feeding seaweed to cows is very early research and a long way from being adopted, a long way from being adopted as a practice by farmers. I understand the comments here about what it might mean to our ocean border living peoples, but I think this is early days. There are other practices, other methods that are being researched too that have nothing to do with seaweed. And just a minor point that actually grazing grass, this is one of the conundrums. We all want rotational grazing to sequester carbon, but grass is a tough thing for a cow to digest or a ruminant to digest. So it actually produces a little more methane. So we need to work on that. So just a couple of minor comments.
One thing, and Alyssa, this is a slight revision of what Alyssa is suggesting, is we could just put the word, and I don't have to feel like research or research and develop climate feed management programs and leave it more like that. Ryan, you got a comment?
Yeah, that's exactly what my recommendation is going to be for this, is those two words preceding this, because we need to ensure we're not promoting actions that will cause downstream or other impacts, and make sure there's efficacy within the program. So in my mind, this has always been an opportunity, whether it's more efficient feed management with homegrown feedstocks or introduction of additional supplements. But absolutely agree, research and development, and then implementation is a three-part process. And to have it housed under one recommendation, I think we'd want to call out those specific actions.
Great. All right. So with those people okay with that, we changed research and develop, and then we leave it at that. Okay. And when I put it in green, it signals it's good to go going forward like this. So if I turn it green and you don't agree, just jump in and say stop. So, okay. The next one was about restore increased forested buffers in agriculture and other settings. And there was some concern of what that would mean for displacement of farmable land, which might in turn have downstream effects in terms of having to draw corn from out of state with its own implications and the like. So I wasn't sure what to do with 29, but clearly people raised some questions. I think it needs some discussion. Brian.
I apologize. Those comments are mine. I raised them after this ag stakeholder event. I'll let Ryan.
Right. Go ahead.
No, I'd be sorry. Okay. Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. a very successful program in the state administered by FSA, NRCS, Agency of Ag, Fish and Wildlife, and other partners to compensate farmers for taking land out of production and planting native woody vegetation adjacent to surface waters. There's other practices that are compensable under this program. So, certainly when I see a recommendation like this, I think about, well, we already have a successful program. The conservation districts run a tree planting program for those that don't want to enroll in a federal program. And so I think about, those voluntary programs that farmers can enroll in that have achieved success. How can we raise awareness, funding if needed, and implementation throughout the state? The second part of that is amendments to the RAPs for, forested buffers. And I need to point out that within statute, there's a provision of law where if the states to require forest and riparian buffers, they have to pay for first priority easement of that land. And so there's some conflict of that within the RAPs. However, acknowledging that there are requirements within there for maintaining vegetated filter strips, vegetated filter strips for which they can be forested, and the requirement to keep from top of bank down in natural conditions. So I think that I might split this or try to couch this under the natural resource restoration programs, and then the other heading about identifying state rules and policies that already have many of these climate benefit requirements in place, and making sure they're inventoried and understanding the limitations before making additional recommendations. I personally think there are there's a robust regulatory framework in place related to this topic, and certainly think additional funding and resources for CREP and other programs is a good recommendation.
So Ryan, so I'm just trying to think, are you suggesting wording changes to this recommendation, or you were just providing detail? Just want to be clear about what your intent is.
Yeah, I think maybe 29, if we were to look within the spreadsheet and find another heading that focuses on voluntary programs for natural resource restoration, including woody forest buffers. I think that part of this heading would fit there. And then the second part, I believe there's another line that focuses on required practices and quantification of what that begets as far as climate impact. And if not, I can offer some language to perform that inventory, acknowledging that there's another climate action plan amendment at least within 4 years. But I think that we need to have that baseline inventory first. Thanks.
Okay, David.
This may be a question really that Jake's in the best position to respond to, but this seems like a really complex question that you raised, Abby, in that at one level, there's this overall need to think about our inventory of balance between, because it's unquestionable that having more land in woody material is one of the top carbon storage opportunities. There's also no question that it's one of the best ways to keep soil on the land and better and more productive soil. So I think there's a really interesting feedback loop between productivity and the creation of the buffers. But there's this deeper question of really what's been happening in Vermont for decades has been a shift from agricultural land to forest land, not intentional, just by virtue of the collapse of dairy and the loss of small and mid-sized farms. And I think we're not, as far as I can tell from the various task groups, we're not recommending that there's an intentional shift to more forest land versus farmland, that we want to maintain and even increase the amount of land in agriculture. And then there's a third level that within agriculture, there is the question, we're far from producing all of the food that we eat in this state, within the state. And I can't even really, it's hard. Others have better imaginations. I can't imagine a world in which we're not getting, mangoes from Mexico. But I do, I think there's this other interesting question that goes to the form of farming that we have, to the extent that we're saying that, say, a large dairy farm that has road, property line to property line corn And we're saying they need to have better, more land in buffers, and that requires them to take corn out of production. I think the argument could probably be made that, well, then they're going to have to bring the corn in from out of state in order to maintain the current model of farming that they're using, which goes to this deeper question of, is that really the best mode of farming to be doing on the landscape? So all of which is to say, I recommend that we keep this in here, that we acknowledge, I think, which is a really important point as we go through these recommendations, and make sure we've got a place in here that we're trying to acknowledge that there needs to be an overall overarching kind of land use patterns evaluation to make sure that we're not unintentionally creating policies that are causing some massive shift away from agriculture into unmanaged lands.
Thanks, David. That's super helpful. And this was just, I wanted to flag it because it was brought up to me specifically by a farmer at that event, and it was something I had just never thought about. And so I felt like it was, something that we needed to at least acknowledge or flag somewhere, that, it doesn't necessarily seem, if, you need 100-foot buffer here or whatever, in theory, that doesn't, that's not that big of a deal or what, but to some farmers that could mean a significant reduction in tonnage or production, and what are the repercussions to that economic, blah, 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 blah. So I wanted to flag it there and appreciate your delineation of the different layers.
Great. I'm putting yellow because it needs a little bit more work, but I think I changed the word to Jake's suggestion in chat. Brian suggested maybe we reorganize it. So it's in yellow because it needs some a little bit further note. And Ryan, I stuck your name next to it because you volunteered. Okay. And an acknowledgement that David just noted more broadly. Okay, so the next two are specific to cluster development. So 143 was reduce regulation of development in towns and village centers to essentially increase building. And 44 was to incentivize and or mandate clustering for new subdivisions. And so there was just some question about whether or not these were the right ways to go. So I wasn't sure what to do. They're obviously heavily related. So I wanted to see whether, one, you could say this is a discussion really for rural resilience because it's really in town villages. So leave it to them and their land use recommendations. That's one option. Option two is to kind of discuss these and figure out what you want to do with them. So clustering activity and development within village centers and or new development. David, then Jake.
I agree, Patrick. This is a pretty sensitive topic. At the same time, we have a housing crisis in the state, and we have all the projections are that due to climate, that more people are going to be moving to Vermont. And I think we've seen as a result of the pandemic, just in the last 18 months, a dramatic shift in the number of people moving to Vermont. And the absence of housing in our village centers and towns and cities, the only choice for people is to move into greenfields for housing. And that has a direct impact on forests and farms. And so I think we should make a recommendation in it. And I might suggest a revision to the way we word it. And it's not so much about clustering development as just removing the barriers to building housing in downtowns and villages and cities, and incentivizing that development. Nobody wants to live in compact development. I don't even really know what compact development means. But I think we all want to, I think there's many people that have no access to really good housing that want to live in, walkable, livable communities. And right now it's harder in Vermont to develop and build in our downtowns and village centers than it is out in greenfields. And that's a significant risk to the kind of landscape that we live on. And that is such a great carbon and climate asset for us.
Jake, Charlie, Alyssa, Judy.
Yeah, sort of building off of that, and just my reaction to this, particular one was that, can we be more specific? I think it's good that we're saying there are barriers, but, especially for someone like myself, I'm not well versed in development regulations. I am in principle very much support of cluster and sort of smart growth and, yeah, sort of putting growth where it needs to be in order to preserve our working land. So, yeah, I'm just sort of searching for like, do we have some examples that we can kind of point to as to what these barriers are that we can kind of build off of, and what, in turn, what the incentives may be to encourage kind of the type of growth that we're seeking.
Jake, I don't know, David, if you want to answer that question or not.
Sure, I'll give a quick response. Some of the barriers are Act 250 regulation and permitting. Some of them are local. Some of the most significant ones, frankly, are local zoning and regulatory obstacles. There's also aging infrastructure. There's a lack of wastewater infrastructure, a lot of other kinds of roads and water lines and electric lines. And so if we really want to encourage development of those places in a way that's affordable and makes money for developers, we have to address those kinds of obstacles. And these are, when I say developers, I'm not just talking about, the big commercial developers, although I would include them, but also people that are developing just basic housing to meet the needs of our communities.
Thanks, David. Marion, you may have a point on this vis-a-vis rural resilience. That's why I wanted, if I can let you jump the line for a second, and then I'm gonna go to Alyssa, Abby, and Judy. But Marion, did you have a point?
I really appreciate everyone's comments and thoughts on this and thinking about the barriers. I did just want to flag that this is especially one of those topics where there is a lot of crossover with rural resilience. And I think in, work that was, or conversations that were had months ago about sort of what rural resilience is focusing on in terms of development and the built environment and compact settlements, that definitely supports natural and working lands, but they are very focused on this, have actions and strategies around those particular barriers, many of which David just listed off. Not saying that this group doesn't need to think about it, but I do want to flag that's, a conversation that needs to potentially happen with rural resilience, and you may not need to spend as much time on it as you are, because they are very much thinking about that and thinking about cluster development in service to natural and working lands as well. So not a very definitive comment, but I do want to flag that there's very much crossover with rural resilience. They're thinking about this. They have full pathways about clustered and compact settlements already.
We could note in the matrix to put it as a, I think as I don't know whether it's an action or a strategy, but whatever it is. And then just note, further work will be done with rural resilience. And then we maybe leave it at that for now, but I'm not sure. Some hands have come up, some have come down. So I'm not sure if your hand went down, so be it. I'm not sure who was next in order. It might've been Alyssa, then Abby, then Charlie.
Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, just as a quick direct response to Marion, I think this is a conversation that clearly we need to weigh in on, and it would be great if there was a lot of time and capacity for rural resilience to think through all of these pieces. I think we've talked about the overlap and the need to have a conversation with them for a long time. And I wonder if you can make a next step in your, I know you have a million things to do, but can you maybe get one of them to come to our meeting next week, or plan a little way for us to interact so that we're not redundant much longer, that we kind of get that signal from where the crossover is and where the opportunity for our and need for our group to input into what they're working on is. And then just for my comment about this piece overall, I just wanted to recount a conversation that I had with Virginia Clark, who's on the Planning Commission in Richmond and is also part of their climate group there in Richmond. And she has been involved in planning commissions for a long time. And I asked her, what do we do? Based on your experience, what works? And she said the guidance has changed. Years ago, they were advised to require 10-acre lots. And that's why a lot of Richmond and Jericho looks the way it does, kind of all divided up out there. And she said she didn't really know what the clear direction was, and that there may be a need and a really great opportunity for some kind of statewide guidance or council or connection among all the planning commissions around issues related to this and the climate implications. So I just wonder if that's a clear next step, is to create some statewide connection among the planning commissions around these issues.
I'm going to note that in there for now. Judy, you were up next.
Thank you. One of my concerns is environmental justice. So what's happening? Do we narrow, if we put this down, do we narrow the relocation of towns or greens or villages when? So I'm thinking of like Brandon. So since 2011, they've gone through 5 town managers because they're all debating on whether to move the town because it's going to flood again. It keeps flooding and flooding and flooding and flooding. They keep rebuilding and rebuilding and rebuilding. So will something like this limit a town that to rebuild the center of town if they have to adapt because of continued flooding?
Anybody respond to Judy's question about that?
Because the river's going to do what it wants to do.
I think all this does is encourage density and incentivize growth in existing settlements. If towns choose to move kind of where they are in response to climate change, this I don't think would preclude that at all.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Okay, so
and again, like Alyssa, like great comments. I do think that this is a place that Rural Resilience is spending a significant amount of time. They've got like directors of regional planning commissions as their co-chairs. So I do think that as others suggested, this is a place where we can probably benefit from their leadership. I do think, I'll defer to Marion, but I think there's a process to kind of coordinate around these cross-cutting issues that the steering committee or the full council is working through that involves the co-chairs. So I think that's all happening, but I don't know exactly what that looks like quite yet.
So Marion, go ahead, and then I'm going to finish up and move us on. Marion.
Yeah, and I think just to Alyssa's comment, Billy and Abby did meet with the Rural Resilience co-chairs. It must have been over a month ago at this point to talk about that overlap. So it's not like those conversations haven't been happening. I think there's just certainly, as with many issues, a lot of overlap that it's really hard to define and sort of silo. I guess Billy and Abby, correct me if I'm wrong. I think the resolution was that, the focus on kind of the built environment and compact settlements would live primarily with rural resilience, and then more of the focus on natural and working lands would live with ag and ecosystems. I know right now Rural Resilience has a process where they're certainly coming up with, they have thoughts around, natural and working lands, but they've flagged those to send to ag and ecosystems to kind of defer the thought process and sort of like the immediate work to ag and ecosystems on those. And so maybe it's a similar process that this subcommittee could take on, is put your thoughts down and then actually send them to Rural Resilience to consider. And as Billy said, there's other sort of processes in the works to gather folks together to think about these broader issues, particularly around land use at a higher level. But just wanted to lay out what has happened thus far.
Jake, and then we try to find a way forward. Jake.
Yeah, so just kind of a question to Marion on that point that was just made is, maybe in the absence of not being able to sort of have an actual sort of dialogue committee to committee, and maybe in our next meeting, what's the best way that we can get a representation of their most current thinking and their action related strategies and actions that overlap with this conversation, so that we can kind of have a way to maybe respond or formally provide input as a full committee and just send that back to them, of serve and volley. So I just it just feels like there is a desire here amongst the members to have a sense of like they've engaged with what that committee is providing related to this issue. So I just how do we kind of scratch that itch in a way?
Yeah, and I'll follow up quickly, Pat, and then I know you want to move on. So, and I can follow up with an email after the Rural Resilience meeting this afternoon, but their strategies and actions, they're kind of doing the same thing as you all up today, walking through major points. Their stuff's already posted online, and they actually have comments in their spreadsheet of flag for ag and eco for their specific actions that they think you all should take a look at. I can see if there's, again, they have a lot around the built environment, barriers to smart growth across all of their pathways. So it would be a lot for you all to look at from that perspective. But certainly we should have kind of that sharing, and that was the intent with them flagging those in their spreadsheet initially. And then I think if you all want to think about developing response to those, or if we need to have another follow-up meeting, it's just, those are getting tough to schedule these days. But yeah, I hear you on that. And I think sort of what we've laid out makes a good first step, at least.
What I'm gonna suggest-
I've spoken with them, and my hope was that after today, we would be in a similar position to kind of share our matrix and flag areas that might be most appropriate for them. I don't know that we're going to get there today, given our pace, but that overall vision that Marion articulated is the one that we're proceeding under.
So what I'm going to suggest, Billy, to that point too, is I'm going to reframe it as David said. I'll note rural resilience is needed. I'm going to strike 44. And just where it's going to be 43 revised as in bold and green. I said the red because we'll strike it and we need to coordinate with rural resilience. So if that's okay, let's move forward. Okay. All right. Now, this is, I think, maybe, and this turns to our forestry folks, there was a number of sort of local wood product ones. And I think people felt like it was sitting as an action, but kind of awkwardly within other strategies. So I think the desire is maybe to make it a strategy, but I don't know, Charlie or whoever wanted to speak to this, but this came up on 52, 53, and 54. In other words, these things are actions right now, but I think people felt like.
Yeah, sorry, it's a little hard to like see them out of context with the spreadsheet. So I think we do need to kind of massage this section a little more. And I think there's some kind of bigger things to think about in this in terms of how we tie wood products, thinking locally, regionally, and tie them into kind of these natural climate solutions as they fit into this with like replacement of high carbon footprint products. So in the interest of time, what I might say is if anybody has any input in this, offer it now. And then I would be happy to kind of massage this with somebody and offer it back to the committee in a more thoughtful framework.
So any kind of, I'm gonna take you up on that, Charlie, but any thoughts or comments on these people want to kind of cover, and I'm going to put them in yellow as a sort of an action item. Judy, go for it.
Could you explain to me, when you're talking about biomass, are you talking about like the willow fields that they're using at McNeil?
I think not knowing exactly where biomass is used everywhere, I think biomass is being used generally as a term just for that material which is harvested and used for either energy or heat generation. Not specifically thinking about it in terms of where it comes from, other than there are recommendations around procurement standards to that end. So I think we need to separate two things here. One is kind of like when we talk about biomass, how it's used, how it's regulated. And then I think we talk about biomass procurement standards, which might be kind of getting at your point, Judy, around, where are we harvesting this from? What are the harvesting standards that we're using?
And what is it for? Because McNeil is the largest polluter in this state. Do you want to continue to encourage things like that?
What is it for? But also like there's recommendations around here around efficiency standards and things like that. So it's kind of one piece of a bigger pie that I think we need to look at holistically.
Judy, any follow-up to that?
No, I don't know. I'm not trusting this till I see it in writing. I want to know what you're talking about, because I've lived through the creation of McNeil and the pollution and all of that. And I don't want to by any means encourage that in other places in this state.
I just want to be very clear. This recommendation is to incentivize the conversion of existing biomass electric lead plants to combined heat and power, which dramatically increases the efficiency of those facilities and offsets fossil fuel use for thermal applications. So like, let's be detailed in what we're talking about here, everyone.
Exactly,
so
Billy.
forward.
Exactly. And it says existing or planned biomass.
Okay.
I'm going to bold that. Let's underline that. David.
Yeah, Billy made the point I was going to make. I mean, McNeil is not combined power and energy, and it is not that efficient.
All right, so I think what I'm hearing is we got to look at these holistically. Charlie's got to look at them where they fit in the overall piece. And we may do some reframing either under a new strategy or some finessing. So Charlie, I'll leave this as an action item to you if that's okay. Judy, anything else? What's that?
No, I just want to see it rewritten.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Judy. As it's written now, we're combining some things and we're teasing things apart that shouldn't be teased apart. So once it's rewritten, I think it'll be easier to kind of review and comment on. We've got just a jumble of ideas kind of sitting here.
Thank you.
I'm not sure I spelled McNeil right, but I said no McNeil or whatever that term of that was. So just noted it for notes. And also I think that Zach is putting some things that CLF's recommending. So Charlie, you want to take a look at those?
Can I just say for the public record, because this is a public document that's going to go out, especially like, let's just take the no McNeil out of that. I think the comments about it are good, but I don't want to call out a specific energy generation facility here because
I don't mind calling it out.
I think there's improvements that have to be made, but I just, again, some of this stuff goes out without context.
Yeah.
And we should just be careful of that.
Good point. Let me just put concerns about some existing facilities. I'm just going to call it that.
And totally appreciating your point, Judy, though, about the concerns there.
Totally fair. I want to be careful about those things. So that's totally fair, Charlie. Okay. Plowing through if we can. All right, let me just save this so I don't lose anything. All right. All right. So carbon offsets. So there was a lot of discussion in the comments about these, whether they're a good idea, whether we open up to international markets, whether we essentially start treating Vermont land as a carbon sink for McDonald's. I don't know, for lack of better terms, just to, not to call it a company. And so we need to talk about this because this is, I think, where one that there's a fair amount of range of views here. So have at it. Take a look at this. We need some discussion.
Can I just start by saying, I think that the offsets piece of this is concerning, especially as we think about kind of the Global Warming Solutions Act long-term goals being net sequestration. And so if we plan to enroll pieces of the landscape as offsets, then they have to be like subtracted from the net sequestration goals at the end. And I think that that's one part that's problematic.
Can you kind of go back to that, Alyssa? So
yeah,
addressing the ideas of leakage outside of our accounting system, right? Like if we're selling carbon credits to somebody in like Timbuktu, that's not stuff we're accounting for here at our net sequestration. But if we were kind of working in a quote like a closed system where credits were developed in state and sold in state, would that get at your concern, or am I not understanding your concern clearly there?
No, I think that if we're going to talk about offsets, that certainly having them within the state is really important. If they're sold out of state, I think we have to kind of subtract them from the inventory. And so there's issues around that. But I think there is possibility for in-state incentives. I would prefer it to be additional sequestration that we're purchasing on behalf of the public rather than offsetting other places where there should be emissions reductions. Does that make sense? So if there's, if somebody wants to offset their transportation use, maybe a company in Vermont wants to offset their transportation emissions. If they purchase them within the state, then they can count their transportation's emissions reduced, but then we can't also count that towards like the net calculation, because that would be double counting. And so I guess I just think there's a lot to think about in terms of double counting. And my preference is that any kind of payment for carbon would be for public benefit rather than offset. So the state could buy it or compensate landowners for that as a public good. But to be offsetting other emissions, I think we could get into some double counting issues. And so I just want, the word offset in the recommendation makes me a little nervous. Yeah, and I know that you have lots of experience. I would love to chat with you for like a long time about this piece.
No, I think the accounting questions you raise are like a huge part of this. And I think some of the recommendations get at or should get at better kind of how do we address these things of establishing a baseline, measuring additionality, all those kinds of things. I guess the one thing that I would offer is like when we think about public purchase of things versus how to engage the private sector, the public piggy bank is only so big. And if there's a way to leverage private capital to incentivize better management of our forests, I think we should look at that as an opportunity, I guess. And that's where this kind of market-based or not looking at kind of like the regulatory systems like in California, but more kind of the voluntary carbon markets. So like you said, somebody who is, I think about like some of like the bicycle companies that generate emissions buying carbon credits from a project on the Kingdom Trails Association's lands. How do we tie these systems together to realize like we can keep it all kind of combined in a way where we can account for it? But again, the accounting is super important. Thank you.
Jake and then David.
Yeah, this is a clarifying question and maybe also an endorsement of the suggested word change or the phrasing of this that's in there. It seems to me that offset programs are an incentive. They're designed to sort of be a more cost-effective way to find emissions reduction. So it's sort of kind of phrase it as incentivize in-state carbon offsets is like, is that sort of suggesting an adder to, or as the phrasing, sort of the suggested phrasing, is it more about sort of leveraging offset, leveraging market-based approaches and solutions to incentivize, in-state offsets and credit purchasing. So I just, that's sort of what I'm struggling a little bit with, sort of how it's phrased and not understanding what the intent necessarily is based on that.
David and then Judy.
I mean, this is one of those areas that breaks my brain, but I do know that there's not enough demand for carbon offsets within the state to really provide the financial incentive for people to shift to more, carbon intensive forms of forestry or land use. So if we rely just on in-state, we're kind of making a decision to take some money off the table. And Alyssa's point is a great one, which is that, if we do sell offsets out of state, they should not count towards our reductions. At the same time, it may be a source of funding for private landowners that helps them better manage their forests and lands. And there are definitely, as Charlie says, in the voluntary carbon markets, there are some. This is not all about coal-powered plants being allowed to continue. There are lots of companies that, for whatever reason, have done everything they can to become as efficient as they possible, but for reasons of branding, want to become net zero, and so they're on the hunt for offsets, and they are looking for the charismatic kinds of offsets like we have in Vermont. So there's an opportunity to bring money in, and it's so complicated that the landowners need some help navigating that. So I kind of have been thinking about a way of ways to incentivize the access to those funds, but recognizing all of the points that Alyssa made, which are valid.
Judy.
This kind of feels like kicking the can down the road to the next generation for me. I keep thinking of the Interville and compost facility and the problems that were there years ago when they kept saying the compost that they were creating justified the fact that they were dumping leachate into the river that was high in carcinogens and arsenic and lead. And it just has that same sense of feeling to me that yeah, well, we can give this one permission, but because it's going to be offset by something else. And I don't want to be a part of anything that kicks the can down the road for the next generation. I want to solve it today.
Okay, so I think, and Alyssa just noted in, so what do we do? Do we say, I turned it to, Abby suggested I turned it to research incentive, research in-state purchase of, here, let me, there. I changed to research in-state purchase of carbon offsets developed by Vermont-based carbon projects addressing concerns of accounting, leakage, equity, etc. We can leave it like that. We can strike it. I don't know what people think.
I think the point about, and maybe it wasn't captured properly in the recommendations or actions that are listed there. Again, I'm not seeing the whole spreadsheet and what other ones were listed here, but I do think that one of the points here was to further investigate and research kind of a Vermont-based solution with this. And I guess I just say at a high level, like if we're gonna get private landowners to manage their forests better, they need to be compensated for that. And if we can create an additional revenue stream which compensates for them for that, that's what's going to do it. We can't just mandate people just start doing things differently without accounting for the economic impacts to them. I mean, owning forest lands has to be economically viable, or else they're going to be sold and chopped up, which is not what we want. And so if there are market-based solutions where we can sell these offsets in a way that accounts for leakage, efficacy, and measurable outcomes and impacts, we need to do that. And so I'm going to push back a little bit and say, I think we can rework this, but I don't think we should just discount this offset credit language. I think that's honestly burying our heads in the sand. So thanks.
And Charlie, I'm wondering if we add the word research, we've not taken it, put it on or taken it off the table. We've tried to explore it further because there are issues and concerns. And I don't know how Alyssa, I know you and some others said, I'd rather take it off. So if we add we focus on the research part.
Can I just ask a favor of folks? As the committee discusses this, we've got committee talking here, we have committee talking in the chat, and then we have public comment in the chat. If I could just politely ask that the public refrain from commenting until the public comment sections so the committee can kind of follow the conversation happening, that would be super, super helpful. I mean, public comment is really, really helpful to the process, but we're trying to follow like 3 different conversations and it's becoming a little bit hard to do that. Thanks.
And folks, just please note the request if you would. Alyssa.
No, I just wanted to say that I think I wholeheartedly agree with like almost everything that Charlie said. I think that land managers need more financial capacity to do better management. And that is like, I think, core behind so much of what we need to do as a group. And I think the only piece that I really disagree with is this: the word of offset is really antithetical to the goal of a Global Warming Solutions Act in increasing our net sequestration on lands. Because when you're using offsets, that, I mean, I just feel like by definition that word means that you're equivalating 2 things against each other. And so I worry that that doesn't really fit within that yes, that's a way to bring in private money to support landowners and making changes, but in terms of meeting the emissions reductions and the sequestration goals of the kind of the task here, I think that it is at odds. And so if we can pick a different word that allows us to explore that without including the word offset, which is kind of the problem, I'm totally in favor. And I would love to chat more with you, Charlie, because I think you have a lot more experience than me and many people with like how to make this happen. But there's just that's the one little piece that I find problematic. So, and if everyone's in favor of just leaving it as research offsets, I will, step back. I wouldn't hold that up, but I just want to share that that's the only piece that I think I disagree with you about.
Charlie, is there another word? Research in-state purchase of carbon.
I'd love, if Allie's on the call, I'd love to have her jump in here with any comments or recommendations on this. I think there is some issue with terminology and how it's used. I think we're also in a situation where we're, for lack of, for better or worse, we're kind of beholden to terminology that is used elsewhere just because that's the common use of it. So I don't know of a better word at this time that we could use that would then translate well to how it's used elsewhere, because I do want to make sure that whatever we do is, lines up with work elsewhere so it doesn't happen in a vacuum. And I guess the offset in principle thing is that we're going to have emissions that are going to occur that we can't stop. And so if there is an opportunity for a private company or individual to, and again, bad word choice, but offset that or whatever word we pick, by providing this opportunity with how private lands are managed, I think we should take advantage of that. So I do agree, it's like ratcheting down the net is incredibly important, but also how do we leverage the fact that there are going to be emissions and how do we leverage that into the impact that we want?
Abby, go ahead.
I want to try to synthesize some of what I'm hearing to try to, I think somebody's not maybe on mute that,
Yeah, Maureen, check that. Go ahead, Abby.
what, Allie, do you want to jump in? I don't want to take over if you have something to add to what Charlie specifically said.
Yeah, I mean, there was certainly a lot of that's, I think what everyone said is sort of valid. There are some, some valid concerns or things we need to investigate when we're talking about these carbon credit offset programs. I think what's rolled into this is, sort of like a bigger question of how are we incentivizing, like Charlie said, but how are we accounting for it too? So one of the things that we need to consider as we are trying to go to a net zero or maybe even net negative status in our state, which I would hope we could get there, as Alyssa said, that actually is sort of a way of offsetting, right? Because the net gets the point, the fact that we have gross emissions and then we have sequestration from our natural and working land. So how do you sort of meld those together? So we need a way to do that. Right now we have carbon offset programs, we have landowners enrolling in them, as we speak. So it is happening. So I think there is a role here of us sort of understanding that they're happening. How can we structure them to be the most valid, accountable, transparent, all those kind of things. I think it's really critical to be involved with it because it's happening whether we, agree with it or not. And private landowners, which 80% of forest land in Vermont is owned by private landowners. And we can't dictate what they do within some, there are some sidebars. And so us in being involved and making sure it is, it does uphold the values of the Global Warming Solutions Act, I think is really important. So this is a great conversation and probably we need to dig into this more. And I will say, just like stepping back, I am having conversations with other states in the region about this very topic. How do we define additionality? How do we approach these voluntary carbon markets that are sort of, there's not a lot of regulation behind them. So that's facilitated by the US Climate Alliance. And I've shared that information with Jane and others. So I'm happy to engage with that or present that information to this group. It's sort of in early stages, but there is, so these are kind of broader questions that lots of folks are asking. And I do think, for us to go it alone in this, like all this other stuff, it's helpful to kind of talk to our neighboring states who are all going through these sort of similar, questions and deliberations.
Abby, and then I have one thought, and then we'll see where we're at with this one. Abby.
Yeah, I just wanted to put a finer point on it as, I think what Charlie's flagging is something that's similar that happens in the ag world as well, right? There's an external macroeconomic, national, international level marketplace structure that's taking place. And so it's our job here. We unfortunately, just like we can't get out of commodity milk pricing. You can't get out of the fact that these carbon markets and offset programs and things like that are already in existence. So whatever we're putting forward, how do we be as proactive and as responsive to both the reality as it exists and then sort of trying to direct our programs, our landowners, et cetera, to try to be incentivized to behave as responsibly as they can. I think the forest sector, there's a lot more to be done to build out programming and education and understanding around forest management and things like that. And so I want to flag that I think Charlie is trying to hold a space that's really difficult as a practitioner, where you understand the points and concerns that are being brought up, but you're also like seeing what's happening for the folks that are existing within that system as it is, and trying to balance those factors is really complicated. And so I just think whatever we're doing, we want to try to account for both of those realities.
So I have a question. What if we, because there was language over on the right side I realized I just caught that says something like explore existing or new carbon market opportunities to incentivize forest management practices which sequester and store greater amounts of carbon and address concerns of accounting, equity, et cetera. So it's broader. We don't use the word credits. We don't use the word offsets. So it's kind of rephrasing this a bit. Alyssa, over to you.
Oh, yeah, I just want to add a little piece. I hope that maybe we could include in our recommendation the urgency of kind of the timeliness of figuring this out soon because of the so many different actors elsewhere that are working towards approaching landowners. I've been approached by a number of different organizations and companies because we're monitoring soil carbon in farms. And I think there are conversations in the Payment for Ecosystem Services Working Group and other spaces that are trying to figure out where this lands. And I think knowing whether or not the state is willing to purchase carbon credits for the public good at the state level will be really important to kind of pushing back from some of those opportunities. So if we can just add a little bit of like the timeliness when this gets written up, I think it's not something we can wait even for like 5 years to address because it will change soon. And we really have a unique opportunity right now to make this work, this climate action plan address this timely issue. And I know that it's challenging and not everyone's like up to speed on all of the issues and concepts and words, but we all know that it's important. And so, yeah, just the timeliness piece. Sorry, that was a little long.
Charlie.
Yeah, I just couldn't agree with Alyssa more that like, if we don't do this, it's going to happen without us. And so if we want to be in the driver's seat, we need to do this now. Because to what she said, I got calls from landowners every day. I got this from this group, this from this group. And honestly, some of the programs that are being pushed out there are frankly bullshit, you know? And if we want that to take over in the state, like we can, but unless we, you know, we need to be in the driver's seat here. So I'd rather we lead it than we be reactive to it.
And Alyssa, I did add some more about urgency. Judy, you had a question about, I think, comment in that first box about equity, because there's some concerns about who benefits from the markets, who doesn't. Judy, did you want to say more?
Yeah, it's not just the equity, like who's enforcing it. All of those questions that somebody put in there are good. I'd like to know the answers to them.
Can you articulate which, sorry, are these the questions around equity with?
No, it's so hard to read with this.
Sorry, okay, I can jump in. That was again.
Okay, wait a minute. How are we creating standards for this to ensure community farmer, BIPOC, forester, logger benefits, not just corporations? How are we dealing with greenwashing? What are the standards around this? Who's enforcing it? Do we need to incentivize this? Is there compensation within the process? How do we ensure compensation is just and adequate to encompass the full worth?
I can jump in because those were my questions.
No wonder I liked them, Allie.
I was just trying to get to some of the things that again, like I was saying earlier, right? I think in some ways, like the ag sector is like maybe 3 years ahead of where the forest sector is now in terms of our understanding of all of a sudden like, ooh, we can go there and we can get things from them and we cannot pay them enough for it, but we can definitely like say that we've done all these amazing things. And I'm seeing that it's the same in farms. You get calls, there's all these programs and things. So those are the things that I'm starting to worry about, you know, how also none of this addresses the fact that like land is owned by primarily white people in Vermont. That seems like a big problem, you know, like to Iris's point that she made quite some weeks ago, you know, that one of our strategies or one of our methods of knowing we've made progress is, you know, how the racial diversity of land ownership is reflective of the racial diversity within Vermont. And so like, these programs are probably largely benefiting white folks. That seems like another problem, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know how we solve it. I just think those concerns need to be noted at the very least.
So I've tried to fold several things into this piece so that we explore and evaluate, because I think that you're getting the evaluation piece. I added some of the kind of at the bottom standards, enforcement, fair compensation, some of the questions Abby raised. So I wonder if this is good enough to go, at least for the matrix for now. And as Iris, I think nicely pointed out, really the equity question here is really top notch, but something we're not quite ready to do this week. So I wonder if the language here that I've got in bold is enough to cut, and we'll replace this with 5758 would be replaced by this one. And Charlie, it still keeps it in the mix.
Well, as long as you have, oh, I see, you just moved it from research in state purchase to explore and evaluate. Is that what you're saying?
Yep. So you're not committing to it. You're evaluating and exploring it. And we've got a number of things that we want to actually explore kind of named below. And I got rid of the word carbon credits because talking about market-based opportunities, because maybe there's better ones that aren't offsets, for instance. I don't know. I can make this yellow and give someone more to go do more work on it. We can leave it for green for now for the matrix. We can always come back to it for the equity screen as Iris suggested. What do you want to do?
I mean, I think we've identified that there's some work here to be done with the language, so keep it yellow and we can just keep fleshing that out for review.
All right, that's good. All right, that's good. That sounds fair. Let me get rid of that. Well, that one we're not trying to. Okay. All right. All right. So I want to stop. We've got through 5 slides. I've got 13. So I want to do a check, and Billy, just check in with you and Abby about how we're doing and how we're going to get to our goal of next week. So we may want to stop it a bit of a process. So Bill, I'm going to turn this over to you for a second. And you may have a few thoughts. And you have to go off mute. We actually have to share.
Well, I was just saying that you're the professional facilitator, so I was hoping you had the solution. But yeah, so right, we are spending a lot of time on each one of these. We're obviously not going to get through all of the items that have comments today. We have a deadline, effectively a Monday, to get this to the council, even though Abby and I pushed back and said we wanted next Friday as our deadline, and we can continue to work on that. But Jane didn't seem particularly relenting this morning. So I don't really know what our options are at this point. I think one option is to try to reconvene this whole group early next week to continue working. I don't know how effective that will be given the amount of time we're spending on each of these without setting like time limits for each topic to discuss. Alternatively, we could try to pull together kind of the task lead group with Charlie that had put together the previous version of the matrix to see if we could make progress on the outstanding issues, then put that back to the group via email to respond to. Those seem like the kind of main options in my head right now. You could just let Abby and I figure it out, but I doubt that's the preferred outcome.
I mean, I think a few things to notice you guys talk about this. So I do think once we kind of got into this, you guys are finally having the conversation you need to have together. And it's just late in the game, pushing up against deadlines. So I think the conversation, in my view, is very productive. The problem is timing, as Billy just noted. There's also a bunch of other stuff in the matrix that are more details that I didn't pull into these things because I felt like we'd get totally lost, but there's still some more work somebody's going to have to do to kind of clean this all up apart from all of this. So Billy, to your first point, I want to just check the willingness commitment of, let me put the 21st deadline aside for a second. I should say that in a secret voice. And it's not, since I'm being recorded, and see if this group is willing early next week to spend, it's probably going to take another 2 or 3 hours to kind of get through this. And then there's still going to be someone who's going to have to take all this and finish it up in terms of a clean version, which will probably be the task leads or the co-chairs or staff or some combination. But what's people's willingness to spend another 3 hours early next week? That's probably Monday, to try to plow through some more of this. We can probably get through, one more of these maybe in the time we have left, but what's people's willingness, desire, given how we're doing today?
I just want to flag, we got to work around the stakeholder engagement meetings if we're doing it early next week. So.
Good point. I mean, give me the, if you think it's worth spending another 3 hours of your time on this together as a group, give me the thumbs up, or if not, give me the thumbs down. I just want to see where the subcommittee is.
Can you put the stop sharing so we can see everyone's?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That was big. Yes, that would be a big help. Okay.
I was gonna say, Alyssa's comment is totally on. I don't think that it's a lack of willingness. It's just like this, legislature, this timeline is nuts. Anyway, sorry, now that's on the public record. There we go.
Yeah,
So
I second that. Thank you, Abby, for flagging that they have to take responsibility for this process.
Yeah, seriously.
About it. Like, I hope they watch this and know that this is on them too. So thank you.
Marion, let me ask you, if you can answer this question, which you can feel free to refuse. what's the consequences of us not getting this matrix done until next Friday?
The counselors saying they didn't have time to review it and pushing off approval of it or whatever, not approval, but like comment, substantive comment on it. That is the consequence. So if you all are willing to take that, there's nothing I can say to, if you don't send me a spreadsheet till Friday, I can't post a spreadsheet till Friday, but it's, you know, we want the council to be able to move and move on. And if they don't have time to review it, they don't have time to review it. So.
I just wonder what options exist for sending them part of it. Like just noting that it's like half of it. We'd like them there if they have the capacity to offer comment on this first half, and we still need to discuss other portions, but we appreciate their comments on the pieces that we feel like we've already discussed as a group. Just a suggestion.
Abby.
Just flagging too that like we didn't agree to that as a committee, and so we're in a bit of a tough. I also want to but I won't do that part. But yeah, I never felt like the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee said yes for sure we'll have this by 9/21. In fact, I'm quite certain that Billy and I said pretty clearly that we wouldn't. So
yes, you did.
And I don't know. I guess I'll grovel at the feet of the other counselors. I don't know. I want to do what's best for the work and for this group, frankly. And I want to honor this process. I think to Pat's point, the discussion we're having today is really important and the things that we really need to be talking about. And to Charlie's point, this is not, we did not put ourselves in this situation. It's the situation in which we were placed. And I don't think that it does any honor to the work and energy and time that everybody's devoted to this, to just shove it aside because we're operating under a deadline that was artificially placed on us. I know I'm going to get in a lot of trouble for this, but so be it.
To Judy's question, what are other groups going to meet this deadline too or not? Or Marion, do you not know?
Rural Resilience will likely have something to post by next week. They've been operating under that deadline. I will say their conversations don't tend to be as lengthy as yours. So they've been able to kind of power through a bit quicker. And I think their list is a little shorter. So that has worked in their favor. Again, they are kind of operating, and you know, David noted some disagreement with this, that there are certain topics, and it hasn't been really controversy at their meetings, but they want to push everything forward, even if maybe some of their members aren't 100% on everything. So they're taking a slightly different approach. So they will likely have something. And then cross sector is doing it at a later meeting. So they aren't posting stuff until another week past next week.
And that's just because of the agenda of the Climate Council.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And for cross sector too, it was, they moved their meeting we moved them on the agenda months ago because they're using feedback from the contract or from the technical analysis. And that only came this week.
So I guess, let me just put that aside for a second. Let's get to logistics. So could we find a time next Monday or Tuesday? And I think Alyssa said 3 hours, maybe it's 2, I don't know, that we could actually do. Can we find those 2 hours or 2.5 hours?
I can do Monday morning. I can find time Monday afternoon.
I'm in the same.
Tuesday is harder because there are existing VCC related stakeholder events and steering committee meetings. For me, at least.
Yeah, very similar here too. Schedule wise.
I can also rearrange something on Monday morning, so I could do Monday morning and possibly Monday afternoon, but that would be a bigger rearrangement. Tuesday is equally more difficult. There's a payment for ecosystem services meeting that afternoon,
right,
which is also very important.
I could do first thing Monday morning. That's about the only slot I have.
What if we try? Okay, now I'm talking like a farmer. What if we try to have an 8 o'clock meeting? I do earlier, but I don't think anybody else will. What if we did? Could we do 8 to 10:30?
I
on
can do
Monday?
that. I know Alyssa said she can only do afternoon on Monday, so okay, she says she can come 8 to 9:30. Judy, I haven't heard anything from you.
Because I don't have a slot on either day.
Okay.
My day starts at 8 and goes to 7.
So you're totally swamped. You're totally full, Judy.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I agree.
So what, and I'm, okay, let me ask opposite of the day, which I know this is an awful lot to ask and you may not want to do it, but there's always evenings. And I know people have kids and that may be a terrible idea, but I just am looking for time at this point.
So Monday evening is a stakeholder event.
Okay.
Just flagging that.
Is that a forced one, Charlie? Okay.
Well, I'm just flagging the big public events are like every day next week.
Yeah.
Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday.
We can't lose our forest folks in this conversation for sure. So
What about early Saturday morning?
Sorry, what was, Judy, did you say Saturday morning?
Early Saturday morning.
No, I mean, that gets me out of a commitment to do a 30-mile bike ride.
does that mean that means you're fine with Saturday, John?
Saturday, we're talking like Saturday, like tomorrow, right?
Right.
Yeah, like 8 in the morning and get it done.
I can
No,
do
that-
it. Saturday is
cannot-
another work day for me.
It is for me too.
I cannot do Saturday. I'm helping promote farm to plate, not farm to plate, but farmer produced food products in Addison County.
Yeah, I have a town forest meeting with a community up here Saturday.
It's not like you're not working, you're just doing something else, unfortunately. Okay. So I think we're not finding a time that works for the full committee here. We're just not. So Billy, I think that brings us back to, again, we still get to have these conversations going
What about
forward.
Wednesday?
You can look at Wednesday.
Well, but in that case, if we go to Wednesday, are we now basically saying, well, why not just Friday? Like the time that we have scheduled and that or something.
Here's what I would say is if you did do it Wednesday, you're still going to miss the deadline. We have the conversation, then someone's got to take this Thursday and clean it up and be able to post it for, maybe you guys take a quick look at it Friday morning. The goal is to try to post it as soon as you can. So the advantage of Wednesday is you frankly just get it to the council before the weekend. I think that's the advantage.
Yeah, at least if you posted it Friday, you'd give them the weekend.
Exactly. So what about Wednesday morning?
I can do Wednesday morning.
I can do Wednesday morning.
Our steering committee at 10 a.m.
I can do 8 to 9 on Wednesday morning.
What if we start at 8 and we try to get through as much as we can? People may have to come and go a little bit, but maybe that's our best bet is 8 to 10 on Wednesday. And we'll get through everything we can. And then let's talk before we close today about kind of what happens after that. But so how about that? Can everybody live with 8 to 10 Wednesday? We'll get through as much as we can. Right. Alyssa, can you do that? Okay. Jake, good. David, Charlie, that's doable.
I can say yes, but I'm probably going to get beat up when someone else gets home today. I'm getting married next week, and I've got a few things left to do before that, and so I'm having a feeling that like the end of next week might be kind of busy. But I will put it down for 8 to 10 Wednesday. Saving the world is more important than my relationship.
Charlie, let me give you advice after 20
Now
minutes.
that's climate commitment right there.
My husband pulled that one on me too. We moved our wedding date 6 months earlier because he wanted to go camping.
Charlie, here's my advice is if you really mess it up next week, your wife will remind you for the next 20 years. So keep in mind, it's not just a momentary pain you might feel.
I'm good. I will put it down for next Wednesday morning, and I will do my darndest to be.
Okay, very, very, very good. Okay, thank you all. So I think let's talk now about what next. So there's still some work to do on some of the details we're not even covering or are not even my slides to cover on Wednesday. And then after Wednesday, someone's gonna have to take this and really hammer it into shape and make some judgment calls for now. So I think, and my view is, and I know this is really hard in this small d democratic process, but I think you're going to have to task 1 or 2 people to do that after Wednesday, because otherwise it'll be too hard to get done. It's really hard to kind of finesse and finalize a document by committee. So I don't know whether you're comfortable letting the co-chairs do that, turn that to staff, designate 2 other people. It doesn't matter who it is, but I just think you'll need somebody to hammer this into shape to post right after Wednesday. What do you think?
I'm sorry, could you just repeat that, Pat?
I think you'll need, after Wednesday, we'll have lots of good comments. There's also a lot of details in the comments and stuff just to kind of clean up. There's some redundancy things. There's like, making sure that stuff are in the right categories. There's some of those comments too. So someone needs to kind of carefully go through all that and essentially create the final product, the final matrix that accounts for as many comments as you can so that you can post it. And that's a pretty tedious process, and it's also much done better by someone else who's kind of 1 or 2 people just holding in their head and doing it. If it leads to a lot of discussion, it probably won't get done. That's why the smaller group, the better. After.
Well, Molly's not here today. Assign it to her.
That was literally gonna be my. She's gonna kill me. No, she's gonna kill you first, John. Thursday is such that if Marley needs help, in theory, I think I can be available to help her if she needs it.
What if we?
Justin will be back as well.
Yes. I'm wondering if we could have one from DC and one from A&R. So if Judson and Marley, if they're willing, would do the hard work. And then if there's any like judgment calls, they feel like I'm not comfortable making it, they call the co-chairs and the co-chairs make the call for them. Because I don't want to put staff in a funny position in that regard. So I don't know how you feel about Marley and Judson kind of working on this next Thursday, if we in fact can get that done. And then any issues they have, they call Abby and Billy for judgment call if they feel it's a tough call.
That sounds perfectly reasonable. Judson, I mean, because it's up to them really. But I think that sounds perfectly reasonable to me.
On a side note, I'm feeling very uncomfortable about Charlie torpedoing his relationship before he's even gotten to marriage. So I just wondered if we could give him the opportunity to maybe finesse some of the forest language or do some of the things that we talked about today. I think those were the only forest related things. And then, I don't know, give him leave to be free to get married.
I'll make it work. No worries. Don't modify things on my end.
Charlie, there's one thing to notice. The next slide is actually some more forest land issues. So if you could join first thing on Wednesday and then maybe jump off, that might work fine. You don't have to stay on this for the whole time. Okay. So I've got Judson, Marley, and Allie, if possible, kind of finesse, turn to co-chairs or judgment calls. And then to Alyssa's point, and this is probably Thursday night, Abby and Billy, is you guys do the final review, Billy and Abby.
I just want to see a thumbs up from everybody regarding that.
We got there. She's there.
So we're meeting Wednesday.
Yep.
We're working to endeavor to consolidate an event based on recommendations through the workday Wednesday and Thursday, and we're not going to reconvene as a group on our regular scheduled Friday meeting to just make sure it's good to go before submitting and posting to the webpage. I feel like Friday would be this is already rushed enough. This is the time we thought we were going to have. I feel it should be reviewed by the full group on Friday.
What time is our meeting scheduled for Friday, Billy? Is that scheduled for regular 10 o'clock?
Currently scheduled for 10.
Okay, so one option is, Ryan, as you said, since it's, get everything kind of done by Thursday night by staff, and then and then post it, including for the public, and then you all can do a final review Friday morning, and then any final finessing, which will have to be on the margins and get it posted by noontime-ish.
And I have great confidence in Abby and Billy. I just feel like that's a lot to ask them to do, absent one last fresh look at the recommendations with the full group was really what I was trying to get at, just to make sure any lingering concerns or thoughts are able to be elevated and hopefully addressed in short order.
Yeah, on the if I can jump in on sort of what Ryan's identifying, I think, again, you're posting the full spreadsheet, but you're not going to be able to present the full spreadsheet to the council. So you're going to have to figure out a presentation. It could be really simple, but which actions do you want the council to act? What do you want to walk through with them with verbally? And that may be what you want to do next Friday.
So I think to that point, Marion, I think maybe there's a two-parter then for next week's meeting, which again, we need to look at time. And this is a lot of time we're asking of people. Is the first part would be confirming the matrix that everybody worked on Wednesday through Thursday. And then the second part would be reviewing a slide deck that would be presented to the council on Monday. And that's what essentially Rural Resilience is doing. So we would need someone to create that slide deck as well. So
they're meeting on Tuesday, not Monday, the 28th.
Yeah, Tuesday.
Sorry. So we get to do it on Friday. Again, they still have the weekend and Monday to review it. So it's not, I know we're not meeting the deadline, Marion, but we're giving them a few days.
Yeah, I'm not worried about posting the PowerPoint early. That's not a big deal. It's the spreadsheet for them.
Exactly. So who would want, co-chairs, I'm gonna leave it to you whether you want to schedule a longer meeting for the next Friday. I'll leave that to you guys to decide. But on the spreadsheet, we would need someone to craft essentially, pathway strategies and some sample actions. In some ways, you could probably start from your July presentation and then just refine it. Marion, does that sound reasonable?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
They start from their July presentation with pathways and strategies and then just refine it and detail it more than what they did in July.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can delete all those intro slides. And you all will have, I think the draft agenda has an hour for you all to present, or an hour for presentation and discussion. So however you want to break that up.
Abby.
I'm so sorry. I'm having such a hard time. There are so many dates and times and things floating around. Pat, just at the end of this, can we do the thing where you send the email with like or somebody sends an email with a very delineated, like, this is what you all are expected to do by this date at this time thing, so that I don't get, we don't get totally lost, because I'm now starting to not know what we're supposed to do by when.
I'll lay it out by days, no problem.
Thank
I'll
you.
do it right after the meeting. So we do, what I'm just going to hang in for, I know we need public comment too before we wrap, is do we have anybody who's going to kind of try to draft us a slideshow to go with this?
I don't think the slideshow is going to be difficult to pull together. I'm happy to be involved, like to do that. I think it's more figuring out what it is we want to present. And, my sense is that it should be issues that we think are going to be kind of controversial or have great bearing on other sectors, things like that. So, I think that's maybe what we need to discuss on Friday, is which actions we call out in that presentation for the committee to focus on. I think putting together the presentation itself is not going to be that big of a deal. And Abby and me can figure that out.
And so, Bill, you would, just to be clear on timing, we'd have the discussion on next Friday, then you and Abby would put together a slideshow and maybe just run it past the committee via email, say Monday, before you present it on Tuesday.
Sure.
Okay. All right. And thank you, Sonia, for putting dates in there. I'll take all that, copy it, add any finesse I need to, and get it out in email as well. Okay. All right, so just to reiterate, thank you, Sonia, very much. I'm going to, the slides that we've gone partial way through, Marion, I'm going to send those to you to send to the group and to post, because I might have missed really important issues to you. I think I captured most everything of the bigger issues, but if there's any, not little stuff, but big stuff that I missed in the slides, be ready on Wednesday to bring that forward. Slides will be available. The next Wednesday, we'll meet 8 to 10 to try to get through the remainder of the issues that we identified as bigger to talk about. Then Thursday, staff are going to work with co-chairs to kind of clean up the matrix and get it pretty much ready to go. That'll get posted Thursday night, probably late, and we will go through that Friday morning and just to make sure it's set to go, and then be able to be postable to Climate Council. And we'll talk about the key issues to cover in the Climate Council that then Billy and Abby will turn into slides for the following Tuesday. And Ryan, just checked, you know that Judson's available next Thursday, is that right?
Yep.
Okay, and I'll shoot an email to Marley saying, I'll blame John, saying,
yeah, I'm messaging with her right now, and she says she likely does have some availability, and and Ally said she did too. So I think we'll, amongst everyone, should have some capacity.
And the staff can work on it Wednesday afternoon too, because we'll be done by Wednesday morning. So.
And I am letting her know that this is John's doing.
Okay, good. Well done. Thank you.
He's on Crow, you people. Come on.
Well, she'll appreciate it coming from you, John.
Well,
If it came from
yeah.
the rest of us, she wouldn't. Yeah.
Yeah.
Farmers always get blamed as the scapegoat.
Especially when they hang out in basements. Let's, Billy and Ed, maybe we should do a quick time for public comment, and we probably need to close.
Sounds good to me. Abby, you good with that? Okay, I'm just trying to find the agenda to see if there's anything else we
All
missed.
good.
I'm looking too. Nope, this is everything.
Okay, sure, then same drill. Anyone who is interested in sharing their thoughts, please raise your Zoom hand or otherwise make yourself known and we'll give you the floor. Okay, Jennifer, I see so far. Anyone else? Okay, Jennifer, please.
I just want to appreciate particularly the conversation surrounding biomass to electricity and the issue of carbon credits offsets, and really know that we have to do this as well as we can. And as people have suggested, the urgency of it. Things aren't going to slow down in terms of companies coming in and wanting to do offsets credits, nor are they going to slow down in terms of land conversion. So the urgency is definitely there. So appreciate everybody who's involved in this. And I know you'll come up with some good approaches and suggestions.
Thank you. Let's see. Zach, I think, is next.
Thank you. Just getting my video started here. Hi, everybody. Zach Porter, Conservation Law Foundation. I just put a link to a paper in the chat here. Like I said earlier, going to be submitting, pretty substantive comments on the original matrix spreadsheet that was sent around last week. Momentarily, you'll all have that to look at. CLF's comments on the material that you all have included in the spreadsheets up until now. And I just wanted to make some specific comments with the short amount of time that we've got here on a couple of things. And one is related to wood products. And I think that it's just critical for this group to take a really careful eye to the way that wood products may or may not play an effective role in reducing carbon emissions and sequestering carbon. The science is out that a lot of assumptions about kind of the positive benefits that have been around of storing carbon in wood products is uncertain or false at best. And so I encourage you to review the document that I put in here and really, look at the full life cycle accounting as you're considering this. It's not a question of whether we need to store carbon in wood products to keep forests healthy and to keep forests as forests. There's a lot of other ways that we can keep forests as forests in Vermont than cutting trees down. And there's a lot more carbon that we can store in forests than that we can store in wood products. And lastly, just on the topic of offsets, again, I'll have kind of more detailed comments included in writing shortly here. But I just think there's been a lot of excellent reports. I encourage you to look at recent reports by Bloomberg on offset programs, focusing in particular on some regional offset projects in the Northeast, to take a get a good feeling about what works and what doesn't with offset programs. And we need to go into this with eyes wide open. So again, I'll have much more detailed comments in writing for you shortly. Thank you, and I'll look forward to the meeting next Wednesday. Have a good weekend.
Thanks, Zach. And I guess I would just ask of you if you're willing to, in your comments, share your recommendations on kind of the income replacement options for the 80% of forest land that's owned by private Vermonters, who many of which rely on kind of ongoing sustainable harvesting for a significant income stream to carry their property and keep it in forest. I think that's always been a concern of mine. So if you believe there's ways for folks to continue to carry and steward that land without harvesting and still generating income, it would be great to see those recommendations.
It's 12:01, so I'm not going to reply to that
Yeah,
right
no,
now,
just
but
in your written,
thanks
in
for
your
that,
written
Billy.
comments, that would be super helpful for us.
And also, we do have some interesting recommendations around, product substitutions, thinking about how we can replace concrete and steel with things like, mass timber. And so I'd love to hear recommendations around how those concerns fit in with these concerns too, because it's complex, but I think we do need to look at the whole kind of cycle we're in.
And the paper I just shared gets at exactly that. So yeah, please do take a look, and I can provide additional research too. We have previously in other comments that we've submitted.
Great, thank you. All right, thanks everyone. That was a long day. We got a few long days ahead of us still, but slowly but surely. And feel free to reach out to Abby and I with any thoughts, questions, comments before we meet next. All right, have a great weekend, everyone.
Hope everybody has a good weekend.
Thanks all. Enjoy your other
Thanks all.
work.
Bye.